Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law Business Law Firm of Northville, Michigan. And today we're going to talk a little bit about internet drama, harassment, my favorite industry, video games, and a little thing called Gamergate, which probably already got this video flagged by YouTube just for saying the words, but is a part of this story, unfortunately, for forces that are beyond the ken of this video. So we're going to talk a lot about a lot of different things. Hopefully we can illuminate, educate, and inform on this topic where the internet has failed to do so in some really important regards. So let's talk a little bit about this. And as a virtual legality, I know there's going to be a lot of folks that have a lot of thoughts and a lot of comments on this particular topic. I will try to address those in the last segment of this video, but please do feel free to converse amongst yourselves in the chat. Just remember that reasonable minds can differ, and we don't want ad hominem attacks or attacks on another person's individuality here in this space. Now, with that said, let's talk about a little curator group on Steam called Sweet Baby Inc. Detected. And if you don't know anything about this company or anything about this story, this might look like a pretty innocuous page. In fact, I think it is a pretty innocuous page. It says, it's a Steam group. For those of you that don't play video games on your PC regularly, Steam is a digital platform that allows you to play PC games, and a Steam group or curator is essentially an account that has been created to make reviews on a specific axis. In this case, identifying games that are made with the help of Sweet Baby Inc., which is a consulting group that works on narrative for game companies. It says a tracker for games involved with Sweet Baby Inc. Then they give reviews of those games, and you can see if you look at through those reviews that this is not a group that particularly likes Sweet Baby Inc. But on its face, and I think we have to look at these things on their face to start out with, this is not something that constitutes anything objectionable to me, right? You look at this and you say, Sweet Baby Inc. detected, a tracker for games involved with Sweet Baby Inc. is just a page that shows when this particular consulting group has consulted on a game. If you love Sweet Baby Inc., you could look at this and say, okay, this is something that I want to use because I want to know what games they worked on because I like buying their products. I have a number of publishers that I buy from because I like what they do with the games that they publish, and they have a heavier hand on what comes out of a game development process than a consulting group does. But I was just on a sale this weekend buying things from Fellow Traveler because they make narrative-based games of a kind of weird indie stripe that was doing a sale on the Nintendo Switch, and I really like all of them. They're really weird games, but I really like all of them, and I looked for that publisher to buy more games from. So that's not that unusual. And in a complete vacuum, you'd look at this and say, well, I don't see any objectionable things about this because it's just good to know. It's just consumer information. I want to know that this group was involved in the making of this game. And if I want to know it because I like that company, great. If I want to know it because I don't like that company, also great. We live in a world where I think everybody has at least knowledge of a boycott or protest of some kind that says this company or this company is doing something that I don't like. And so I'm going to make sure that I don't spend my dollars there. I don't purchase that product or service. And so that in and of itself does not rise to the level of anything terribly controversial. Now, I started this video by talking about this particular Steam group because I think this is where the story starts here in 2024. I should mention that as someone that talks about video games a lot, especially on the Bitcast, which is on Sundays on Season Gaming and also simulcast on this channel, that I saw reference to Sweet Baby Inc. as a company worth consideration as early as the middle of last year. When I was saying I was looking forward to Alan Wake, when I was talking about other games that year, people were coming into my chat comments or otherwise sending me messages that told me that I needed to be wary of Sweet Baby Inc. or otherwise be more knowledgeable about the process that these games were going through in their design. And so I do think that there are some truth values to the notions that there's a conspiracy theory being fomented by certain forces on this side of the equation that don't like Sweet Baby Inc. But I think more predominantly, there's a story being told against the people that make a site like this, a curation group like this, that also needs to be told, which is why I'm making this video today. So with that said, let's take a little look at the Steam support rules and guidelines for Steam, because this is going to come up in a number of different places. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that the most predominant rule set for using Steam and acting within the community is interactions with other players, and we'll also see later Steam personnel. So when we see Steam define problems, they say disrespectful content can include insults or harassment directed at other players. We also see that reference to encouraging or facilitating real world violence is bad, right? And I think we can all agree on that. I think we can sit here and talk about a topic like this without getting into the substance so much and say, you know what? Encouraging or facilitating real world violence, that's bad. Harassing someone is bad. But what does that mean? That's where these discussions really come to the fore. That's why I wanted to talk about this in virtual legality, even though we've got a long list of articles to discuss, which really raised this subject to the front of my mind and wanted me to make this video. Continuing on this line, we see the online conduct secondary page here says harass other users or Steam personnel. We see you can't violate others' intellectual property rights by using another's trademark or copyrighted material, which ostensibly the use of Steam of Sweet Baby Inc. as the name here and the kind of reverse image of their trademark logo is a version of using that trademark material. But in no way would you expect this rule set to be referring to a reference to a company, right? When we talk about violating another's trademark, it is making it look like what you are saying is coming from them, saying this is a Sweet Baby Inc. message, and then not having any relation to them. And that's part of what we see as part of the fight in this particular topic, is that the argument from some Sweet Baby Inc. folks was that the curator doesn't have any rules about what they can actually link to Sweet Baby Inc. so they could be used as a kind of broader attack on Sweet Baby Inc. as a company. Now, that doesn't wind up happening as best I can tell. None of the things that I saw referenced were not games that Sweet Baby Inc. worked on. So that's another interesting part of the story. But first, we have to see how this has been covered in various outlets for the last little while. So Sweet Baby Inc. doesn't do what some gamers think it does, says Kotaku. And if you're familiar with Hangouts and Headlines in this space, you know I like to cover journalistic enterprises. I like to talk about headlines and the way things are reported on, because there's a lot of editorializing, there's a lot of eliding of subject matter that can happen just with the words that you select as you report on these various things. So this is a Kotaku article. This is by Alyssa Mercante, and it says Sweet Baby Inc. is not the largest narrative design company in the games industry, nor is it solely responsible for the characters and stories in recent high-profile releases like Alan Wake 2, God of War Ragnarok, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. But good luck telling some gamers that. So if we look at this paragraph, we see the first kind of straw man that we'll see used against the folks that are against Sweet Baby Inc. a lot, which is that the people that don't like Sweet Baby Inc. think that Sweet Baby Inc. is solely responsible for any issues that they might have in games like Alan Wake 2, Ragnarok, or Suicide Squad. And I do think that's a straw man, because I don't think reasonable people are looking at Sweet Baby Inc.'s presence as a consultant for these game developments and thinking that they are the sole responsible reason for why some of these things didn't turn out the way gamers might otherwise like. And with that being said, as a kind of prelude to reading this article, I do want to mention that I did not like God of War Ragnarok. You can see me discussing that on Bitcast. I thought Suicide Squad was okay, but didn't love it. And I did not like one of the other major games that you'll see referenced here, Spider-Man 2. And I didn't like them for some of the reasons that appear to be on the edges of what this entire discourse is about. I didn't like God of War Ragnarok, and I didn't like Spider-Man 2 because they seem to have meandering plot lines that kind of delved into tokenism and various other problems that I had with the storyline in those games that took focus away from what should have been a fairly tight narrative piece. And I say that as someone that doesn't really mind a company presenting its politics or its position on the world in its games, movies, or television shows, as long as they are informative of the story that that game, movie, or television show is trying to tell. I love Spider-Man the first. I love Miles Morales, and something changed between those two games and Spider-Man 2. Is it this company's involvement? I can't say. I'm not in the room. But it is something that I think we can take a look at and say, what happens in Spider-Man 2 is that there are a lot of subquests and storylines that are focused on diversity and representation in various ways that do take away from the plot momentum and storytelling that should actually be happening in a narrative-focused game. So I look at this and say, maybe Sweet Baby Inc. is partially responsible for the meandering nature of some of the games that I really dislike over the past couple of years. But I also say, I love Alan Wake 2. It was my favorite game of last year. And I don't hate Suicide Squad. So where does that leave me on this particular company? Like most companies, saying they can do good, they can do bad. For a consulting company like Sweet Baby Inc., it's probably a function of how strong the narrative lead and control within each of the companies actually is, right? Is Sony Santa Monica taking on more of the narrative responsibilities or less? Is Insomniac taking on more or less? Is Sweet Baby Inc. filling that gap, or are they pushed aside a little bit? Alan Wake 2 does not have a very strong political component to it. It's a strange, dreamlike game, and with one exception, which I'll talk about in just a second, there really isn't much politics of the real world presented in that game, right? If you're not living in a different dimension, if you're not otherwise worried about whether or not you're in the shadow realm and fighting fiction, you don't have to worry about these things from the Alan Wake 2 standpoint. But there is a line towards the end of the game where Saga Anderson, who is the black female protagonist that is the other side of the game with Alan Wake, says out of nowhere that she doesn't like the old white men that have kept her down in job promotions and whatnot. And Saga Anderson is a very strong character. Saga Anderson is someone who has the power of gods and dreams and foresight within her. And I'm not going to spoil Alan Wake 2, but this line kind of comes out of nowhere as a non sequitur and really does speak of modern politics on these things in a way that I find very distracting to the gameplay that I'm actually enjoying, right? So Alan Wake 2 still my favorite game of last year. I don't know that Sweet Baby Inc. put that line in. That might be straight from Remedy, the developers of the game. But I did think that that was a step that didn't make much sense for the character that had been told up until that point, but made more sense for black female protagonist to say that doesn't have any other characterization. And I think if you're looking at Sweet Baby Inc. and you want to characterize them as someone that tends to do this, and you use Spider-Man 2, that line in Alan Wake 2, and some aspects of God of War Ragnarok as your example, I think you're worth listening to, even if I don't think Sweet Baby Inc. is quote unquote solely responsible for these things. So that's a long segue, but it's one that I think is important because when we talk about Gamergate or we talk about Sweet Baby Inc. Gate or whatever we want to wind up calling this thing, we'll see others refer to it as Gamergate 2 in just a minute, then I think we have to give reasonable minds their place in the sun here. We have to say, okay, we can create a straw man. We can say there are bad actors on either side of this thing, and there certainly are, but that doesn't defeat the entire argument that one or the other side is making on these important points. So, continuing with Kotaku, late last month, one of the company's consultants discovered a Steam group dedicated to detecting games that Sweet Baby Inc. has worked on. The purpose? To encourage people to avoid those games because the group had deemed SBI was pushing a quote-unquote woke agenda, and I've talked about the word woke and its usefulness or lack thereof in my video on Gemini earlier this month, by working towards greater diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Steam group now has more than 100,000 followers and its own Discord that boasts nearly 2,000 members. But this ire against Sweet Baby Inc. and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in general, isn't new. An October 2023 Kiwi Farms post shares similar sentiments, stating that the company's involvement in Remedy's award-winning 2023 action game Alan Wake 2 was possibly one of the biggest scandals in gaming history. The conversation around Sweet Baby Inc. has ignited a fundamentally misinformed Gamergate-esque firestorm. Its employees have faced rampant harassment as a direct result. Now, I do want to point out, I researched a lot of this to do this video. I looked at a lot of articles and things. I didn't actually see this rampant harassment as a direct result to SBI employees in the forums that I could look at, right? I can't look at every Discord post that would have been made over the last month or two. I can't look at various other places that these things could have been hidden. But the fact that Kotaku doesn't actually reference anything directly here and just frames it as they have faced rampant harassment as a direct result is something that does raise at least my alarm bells and say, okay, well, that's useful for the narrative of what's being presented in this article. But without more indications of what is happening, I can't take that on its face. Industry figures have had to deny allegations that SBI comes in and completely changes their games. I spoke with several employees of Sweet Baby Inc. to learn what the company actually does and how the misunderstanding of its role in the industry highlights a far broader problem. What bad actors think companies like Sweet Baby Inc. do? The games industry has had its fair share of struggles lately, from massive layoffs to wildly expensive games like Suicide Squad falling short of expectations. According to the loudest members of the Sweet Baby Inc. detected Discord, the company is directly responsible for those failures, not the studios that employ them in the first place, because of the content Sweet Baby allegedly forces into games. And again, I look at this a little bit differently. I look at this description as more of a straw man, and I'm not saying that there aren't people on that Discord or in that group that don't think this, right? I do think that probably Kotaku is describing some folks that are talking about this particular issue, but I don't think it's the most reasonable, most understood position here. I look at this situation and say, okay, Sweet Baby Inc. isn't forcing these things, but they could still be a useful indicator to the companies that are open to allowing their narratives or their stories to be directed in various meandering ways that take away from plot momentum and overall make their game worse because they want to signal one way or the other on these topics. And those are the most likely companies to hire a Sweet Baby Inc. And so the presence of Sweet Baby Inc. is a signal about those company developers and publishers, not the effect or force that Sweet Baby Inc. has in the room on these various topics. So I think if you look at it that way, you can see how this particular indication, detection of Sweet Baby Inc., as it were, and the detection consists of highlighting the games that are already on their website. We'll see that in a second as well, is useful to some people that say maybe they are responsible for some of these problems. Even games that are widely considered to be successes and not safe from these conspiracy theories. Alan Wake 2 game director Kyle Rowley took to X on March 3rd to dispel rumors that Sweet Baby was the reason protagonist Saga Anderson was black, a rumor first traced back to the aforementioned October 2023 Kiwi Farms post. It's absolutely not true, Rowley wrote. I'd argue it actually was originally kind of concepted out because they did a trailer for what Alan Wake 2 would ultimately be within, I think it was Quantum Break. And at that point in time, the partner to the Sam Lake character was a white woman, but obviously games can change and there's all sorts of different directions they can take on it. And the lineage and role that Saga Anderson plays in Alan Wake 2 makes sense for her to be a black woman, even though, as I said, the line at the end doesn't make a ton of sense because she spent the whole game investigating what amounts to a small Finnish city in the Pacific Northwest and otherwise has Finnish parentage as well. So it isn't something that makes a ton of sense to me, but is more evocative of that kind of tokenism that I do see throughout Spider-Man 2 and especially the Miles Morales plot lines, where I love the Miles Morales separate game and very much did not like his character in Spider-Man 2. On March 5th, I managed to spend an hour or so in the Sweet Baby Inc. detected Discord. Yes, you can see some of the Discord entries that this author had on Twitter before I was booted from the space, likely because I identified myself as a Kotaku journalist. In it, members shared posts referencing Feminist Frequency founder Anita Sarkeesian, Marcus Aurelius quotes, and pictures of idealized female bodies in games. One image showed several pictures of the protagonist Eve from Korean developer Shift Up's upcoming action game Stellar Blade, juxtaposed against female characters from Overwatch, Forspoken, and Life is Strange. Embrace tradition, reject modernity is emblazoned on the collage. Modernity, I don't know how to say that word, so maybe you guys can help me in the chat. Reject the modern. And here's, I think, an example of this picture that was grabbed from the Discord. And we talked about jumping into Discord communities when we talked about the Nintendo versus Yuzu lawsuit, and that Nintendo had people clearly in the Yuzu Discord talking about things and capturing quotes to use in their lawsuit later on. So do know that if you're writing something down somewhere, then anybody could be in that community looking at it. And remember that when you're talking about things, don't harass people, don't threaten violence against people, but also just remember that when you write something down on the internet, anybody could be watching. Two members that spoke with me via Discord DM shared similar sentiments about why they believe the Steam page and subsequent Discord are important. So they can identify games that were developed with support from Sweet Baby Inc. and make an informed decision when purchasing them. Sweet Baby Inc. is a symptom of other ideological worldviews that I believe have taken hold of the Western world, media, and gaming as a whole, a 31-year-old member of the Discord told me. He also insisted, without providing evidence, that Sweet Baby Inc. adds race and identity group quotas to everything they are involved with. And I think these are useful quotes, again, for kind of concept that isn't the same as what has been summarized at the top of this article, but that is the presence of Sweet Baby Inc. is an indication of what this developer and publisher wants to do with their story. And as someone that loves narrative, loves storylines, and does think that sometimes whatever it is that you want to do that's outside that plot line or narrative, whether it's talking about DEI initiatives, talking about diversity representation, talking about anything, you could be talking about Ayn Rand philosophy, and I still think it could take away from your plot line. I think that BioShock is the most prominent reference to that, but I do think it happens all over the place from different perspectives and different politics, and it's something that I think is a problem with not just video games, but with movies and television as well. Sweet Baby Inc. isn't forcing diversity, it's happening naturally, says Kotaku. Though these kind of social media posts argue that companies like Sweet Baby Inc. somehow force game studios to include diverse characters and storylines, the reality is vastly different. Sweet Baby Inc. is a narrative design company, meaning most of its work is focused on writing stories and dialogue. They are not a DEI consultancy firm. That means they ensure a game's plot points make logical sense and are satisfying to players, and that characters speak and behave in consistent ways. I would say that means they try to ensure a game's plot points make logical sense and are satisfying to players, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, because I do think Spider-Man 2 is an absolute tire fire of plot points and narrative dead ends. And part of that is because of some of the tokenism and things that they do in that game. But Sweet Baby Inc. is a narrative design company, meaning most of its work is focused on writing stories and dialogue. I don't know anybody that disputes that. That means they ensure games' plot points make logical sense and are satisfying to players. They attempt to do that. Narrative designers may also provide a final round of polish, like a Hollywood script doctor. For example, the team worked on Suicide Squad long after the story was written, and even then they joined just to write in-game ads, audio logs, and NPC barks. CEO Kim Belair tells me over video calls. She continues, Sweet Baby is, at its core, a narrative development company. That means anything from script writing to narrative design to narrative direction to story reviews. One of the things that we do offer is cultural consultations or authenticity consultations. For us, that generally means that we might be asked to look at a story if there's a character in it who is marginalized in a certain way, and the studio wants us to connect them with a consultant who can bring a little bit of authenticity. But the perspective is never that we're coming in and injecting diversity. For the most part, it's the reverse. It's that a company has created a character and they want to make that character more representative and more interesting. And I don't see anything in this quote that would suggest that the Sweet Baby Inc. CEO is lying, right? That is exactly how I believe the consultancy works on these particular topics. Having been in corporate America for a long time, that is what consultants do, right? Consultants come in, and one of the major criticisms of consultants in the business world is that they come in and tell you what you want to hear, charge you a bunch of money, and then leave, right? So this is a description of the company says, we need diversity, we need representation, we want authenticity in this particular score. They hire Sweet Baby Inc., and then they move forward, right? Sweet Baby Inc. does what they want, that what the company wants them to do, and then everybody moves forward. So I don't think Sweet Baby Inc. is causing these things, and I do think that that's a fair criticism of the people that think that they are causing it. But I also think this is a bit of a straw man from Kotaku and some other places that we will see, because I think a reasonable person can still say that they don't have to cause it to be a useful signal to when a company is taking on things that are going to overall hurt the flow and narrative momentum of their game, because they're interested in focusing on other topics. And I say that as somebody who would much rather have authenticity in all of their characters, right? Everything that is in a video game that's focused on narrative, like a Spider-Man, like an Alan Wake, should be looked at through the lens of making sure that the characters are consistent, are authentic, and are following through in the world that has been created for the story purposes. I don't think that always happens in video games. I want that to happen. But simply taking Miles Morales and putting him in a completely different plot line about saving Harlem Jazz or what have you in Spider-Man 2 is not useful diversity or representation when you're trying to make a Spider-Man game. Sweet Baby co-founder David Bedard adds that, contrary to popular belief, the people making these games want to make the experience better for all players, and that more diversity and representation is a byproduct of that. Detractors would rather believe that there's a shadowy cabal of people forcing them to put that stuff in. They would rather believe a make-believe fairy tale than accept that. He says making something more representative and more joyful for a marginalized person in a video game is not a zero-sum game. It doesn't make anything worse for the male character in the game, for the white character in the game. And I think reasonable minds can, again, disagree on this particular topic, right? Reasonable minds can differ on this particular score. It's not a zero-sum game to be more authentic or better representation, certainly, but it is a zero-sum game when we talk about narrative momentum and a consistent and satisfying plot. You can imagine your favorite movie, your favorite TV show, or your favorite video game just deciding to take a 3-hour segue into discussing the nature of, I'm going to use Harlem Jazz again because that's what I remember the most from Spider-Man 2, but that any specific detour can take away from the overall effect of the storyline, right? If you're watching Dune and you get a 2-hour description of Fremen society and the way still suits work, it's not going to be terribly useful to your understanding of what's happening on Arrakis or in that plot. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game in the way that they suggest it is with their straw man argument, but it is a zero-sum game to somebody that wants a consistent narrative. And I do think Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales were better at that. Maybe Sweet Baby Inc. was involved in those games. I don't know. They're not referenced on their website. But I do think Spider-Man 2 is a great example of when plot points and emphasis on representation and diversity, overall good things, can take away from the telling of a story. The assumption that team members at Sweet Baby Inc., or any marginalized person for that matter, can only offer up content that is based on their identity is incredibly frustrating for the team. People can't imagine that we might do anything else but DEI, and we'll look at their website in just a second. They can't imagine that we're just talented writers, that we're talented narrative designers, and that people are hiring us because we tell good stories, because we collaborate well, and because we write video games. They have to diminish our accomplishments to our identities. They can't imagine that the work I did on Spider-Man was story work versus adding pride flags, you know? I can definitely imagine that the work you did on Spider-Man was story work because I played that game. Despite the intensity of the backlash over the past few weeks, it's business as usual for Sweet Baby Inc. The companies they work with haven't been scared off. They've actually offered advice and best practices for how to move forward. Practices they've developed after facing harassment of their own, Belair told me. With that kind of support in their corner and a shared love for writing good stories, the team at Sweet Baby Inc. is determined to forge on and keep working on a litany of games, both announced and under wraps. We are a narrative company. That primarily is our work. We are not censors. We have no interest in a false diversity or in tokenization. We have an interest in making stories better and making characters more interesting, and in developing a stronger language around narrative design. Those are the things that we are really passionate about. If you're going to come for my work, you can do that. If someone says I wrote a story and you say it's not good, that's totally fine. I hope you see this video because that is what I'm saying. But if you're going to come for me, at least come correct. Don't be loud and wrong. And I look at this as any kind of other situation where what you try to achieve is not necessarily what you achieve, right? I have no doubt that they don't have interest in false diversity or in tokenization and they want to make stories better. That doesn't mean they are doing that, right? I often use the example of Michigan football. You've seen me in this space talk about my Michigan Wolverines and how much I love their football team and say, I would want nothing more than to help the Michigan Wolverines down the field to score points and to beat their opponents. I would be terrible at it, right? I would want to help, but I am not good at throwing a football, and I would be a detriment to their ability to score on their opponents. So you can want a lot of things. It doesn't mean that you're actually achieving those things. With all due respect, it really just seems like the same thing to me, but it's just a bit more hands-on in the writing process. The end goal is to insert DEI type stuff into the project they are working on, says one of the Discord members. Sweet Baby Inc. and other industry leaders suggest that this dogged insistence on believing one company is forcibly injecting diversity into games is a side effect of a widespread misunderstanding of how games are actually made. And hopefully this conversation is helping a little bit with that, right? This is a company that wants to do these things. I believe that quote. That is how consultancy works. You go and you find a consultant that's going to do what you want. You pay them their money and they do what you want. So I don't think Sweet Baby Inc. is causing this to occur. I just think their presence is a useful signal to when it is occurring. And that can be useful for people that are evaluating what products and services they wish to buy on their own. That in and of itself is not harassment. Until the industry is more willing to openly discuss development processes, the lack of transparency will continue to be used as a straw man for bad faith arguments that characterize DEI as an imposition by nefarious unseen forces rather than an effort to cultivate a more accurate reflection of the world around us. It's interesting that they use that as a straw man when this is in and of itself an entire straw man paragraph, right? These people don't have to believe that it's nefarious unseen forces rather than an effort to cultivate a more accurate reflection of the world around us. They can really be looking at this purely as story and satisfaction terms, right? Why do you find Spider-Man 2 less satisfying than Spider-Man 1? And the answer isn't because they spent less money, because they spent more. There's more characters, there's more skill trees, there's more plot, it's bigger, but bigger isn't always better. We've known this for a long time, right? Spider-Man 3, the movie, is the worst of the Sam Raimi trilogy because they tried to put in too many villains. They tried to do too much stuff with that plot line. There is editing necessary to make good, consistent narratives. And writers know this. But Sweet Baby Inc. seems to be in the business of making sure that all of these other bases are covered rather than directly affecting the story, which I do think is probably in the hands of the developer. That said, we have more, right? Because this author, we mentioned her name before, Alyssa Mercant, has been online basically drumming up some of the discussion here because engagement is useful on social media, right? So her banner right now is, "Hi, you can't be racist against white people. Thanks for tuning in," which is part of a discussion she was having on this particular topic. And I've mentioned this in the past. I don't like to get political in this space. You should see some chat bot messages about not being particularly political on this channel. But I do think that this is a destructive kind of notion. I said this when I was discussing the Gemini case before in Hangouts and Headlines, and that is that I do agree with Chief Justice John Roberts, which is a very rare sentence for me to say, when he says that the only way to end discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And right, this is a notion that is relatively recent, that the word racist and racism can't be applied to some group that is otherwise in power, so to speak. And I don't know what power I have necessarily, but the notion is that oppressed people can't be racist towards their oppressors and whatnot. And I think it's very destructive because you can 100% be whatever ist you want to apply based on immutable characteristics or otherwise to someone that you want to put beneath you, right? So you can 100% be racist to any specific race. You can be misogynist. You can be misandrist. You can do all these various things regardless of the power structures that you find yourselves in. That's a very academic notion. I don't find that to be very applicable to the real world. And I find that to be pretty destructive as a concept. And that's why she's getting into these fights online about this particular topic. And she made it her banner because she's a bit of a firebrand. So that's fine. You're allowed to be a firebrand online and to write Kotaku articles about that. But let's continue with our discussion of how this is being covered in the video game space. Here's Aftermath, which is a number of ex-Kotaku folks, how a small video game narrative studio wound up at the heart of a massive anti-woke conspiracy theory. Sweet Baby Inc. doesn't even remotely do what many think it does, but on the modern internet, that doesn't matter. Stop me if you've heard this one before. There's a shadowy cabal that's somehow equal parts diabolically omnipotent and comically incompetent. An entire segment of society dangles from their fingertips, held up by puppet strings so thin as to be almost invisible. It's a tale as old as time, or at least as old as conspiracy theories ranging from Illuminati to Pizzagate and QAnon. I mean, honestly, this YouTube video is going to be locked 3 ways from Sunday. Now, conspiratorially minded gamers have added a new one to the heap, Sweet Baby Inc. Sweet Baby is a 16-person narrative development and consultation studio that aims to tell better, more empathetic stories while diversifying and enriching the video game industry and make games more engaging, more fun, more meaningful, and more inclusive for everyone. Since its founding in 2018, it's worked with a high range of high-profile clients, including Sony, Xbox, Remedy, and Rocksteady on games like God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, and Suicide Squad, as well as indies like Goodbye, Volcano High. Nobody outside the industry cared until late last year when users on sites like 4chan, Kiwi Farms, and Gamergate subreddit Kotaku in Action, incensed by developments like the presence of Saga Anderson, a black woman in Alan Wake 2, took notice of Sweet Baby's involvement with multiple big games. And again, we see here the stolen base, right? We don't know because this article hasn't even bothered to describe exactly what the issue with Sweet Baby Inc. is yet, but it's described as incensed by developments like the presence of Saga Anderson, a black woman in Alan Wake 2, which I don't think is necessarily what a lot of people that come to this party are thinking. You can't have black women in video games is not really on the tip of my tongue when we talk about these issues, but it's fair argumentation from sites like this and other articles that we'll see to lump everyone in with what would be the worst actors on this, right? You saw bad actors referenced in the Kotaku article. You see it referenced kind of in an alighting fashion here. From there, the conspiracy theory metastasized. Sweet Baby, users not just on the aforementioned sites, but also Twitter and YouTube began to suggest, was ruining games with its woke agenda, which is why Suicide Squad, but conspicuously none of the other AAA hits I just mentioned, flopped. People claimed Sweet Baby was weaponizing a culture of fear and intimidation, bullying otherwise apolitical studios into accepting its terms. This line of thinking led to the formation of numerous anti-Sweet Baby initiatives, including a Discord, which Kotaku's Alyssa Mercante gamely braved, and a Steam Curator page called Sweet Baby Detected that lists every game in which Sweet Baby has been involved and advises players to steer clear. In the past handful of days, that page has jumped from around 40,000 followers to over 200,000 after calls from Sweet Baby staff and game developers to report their account. Now, we'll talk more about this in a second, right? Because this is one of the main fights online is who started this, what's going on at all, as well as videos from big content creators like YouTubers, Some Ordinary Gamers, and OTK founder Asmongold that credulously platform the conspiracy ideas and ringleaders. Predictably, all of this has resulted in ample harassment of Sweet Baby employees, which again is not otherwise demarked here, which seems odd because you're marking everything else. But why have Sweet Baby's supposed intimidation tactics brought the industry to its knees? That's where the conspiracy theory, by necessity, had to go big. Some have come to believe that Sweet Baby's services were being forced on developers by corporate overlords obsessed with DEI, which in turn were born of a desire to secure ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance investment from gargantuan firms like BlackRock and Vanguard. Yeah, that BlackRock, which does actually invest in companies like Microsoft, EA, and Take-Two. And so by that logic, you can also attribute a significant portion of video game industry layoffs to Sweet Baby, since those layoffs stem from trouble in the investment sector, and you'd better believe that conspiracy theorists did. So now people are running around suggesting that BlackRock indirectly or directly controls a tiny narrative studio, which in turn controls the video game industry. And again, you see kind of the stolen base here, right? Because the notion of this quote unquote conspiracy theory would be that companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, which absolutely exist and absolutely invest in tons of companies in the stock market and other sectors, have ESG rules that require their investments to have certain kind of corporate responsibility provisions and aspects of what they're putting out into the world, and that might be encouraging some of these developers slash publishers to use services from a company like Sweet Baby Inc. And so that is a result of why we're seeing video games not being sold through as much, because people are rejecting some of the notions of these narratives. And that is a plot point, that is a plot line, that is a series of facts that can bear the weight of those assumptions. And they're instead characterized as, oh, you're thinking of BlackRock as twiddling their fingers and curling their mustaches in some kind of black shadowy corner, ensuring that folks like Sweet Baby are enforcing diversity initiatives and whatnot. It's a conspiracy theory that checks all the boxes. It conveniently explains pretty much everything happening right now, ties it back to organizations of which people are understandably suspicious, links it to a much larger ongoing panic, DEI, validates preconceived notions like go woke, go broke, sprinkles in a few kernels of truth regarding powerful interests, and more importantly, provides a clear and identifiable enemy. It's also almost entirely bullshit, says our esteemed author. While the Sweet Baby conspiracy theory has picked up steam among larger content creators in recent weeks, leading to trending topics on Twitter and millions of views on YouTube, many of those who've propagated it over the past few months demonstrably have no idea how game development works. For example, depending on who you talk to, one of the many things Sweet Baby did on Spider-Man 2 was dot its digital reimagining of New York City with pride flags. That is not what any consulting firm does, especially not one that specializes in writing. We worked on Spider-Man 2 for about 3 years, and our focus was on story. The overall story, characters from Pete to Craven to Harry to Miles, Sweet Baby CEO Kim Belair told Aftermath. I think that's reflective of the shape of this whole thing. The assumption will always be that our focus is going to be on DEI, but the reality often is that we do more narrative work. And the narrative in Spider-Man 2 is a straight up tire fire. I can tell you that. I can tell you that towards the end of Spider-Man 2, no spoilers, they straight up have Mary Jane Watson come out and attack Peter, and Peter say, you were always the stronger of us, and you were always the one that was leading this family, et cetera, in a way that's, again, completely out of nowhere and not reflective of the characterization that we had seen throughout the rest of the game. It's those kind of political moments that happen in these games that are off-putting when you're trying to follow a narrative. And Spider-Man 1 didn't do that, and Miles Morales didn't do that, and Spider-Man 2 does, very definitely. We did a lot of rounds on the treatment, said Belair, referring to the game script synopses. We came in, we looked at certain levels, certain ways to better accomplish the goals of the project. In the end, especially in the last sequences of the game, there's a lot of stuff that we changed and figured out. None of it was related to diversity or anything like that. It was literally about what is the best Spider-Man story we can tell. And a reasonable person can look at that and say, okay, if that's the best Spider-Man story we can tell, I'm not interested, right? And so if you're going to be involved in the next Spider-Man story, I will take that into account and look at something like a Sweet Baby Inc. Detected. And yet what we have here that on a defensive side is you must think that we are just trying to ruin everything and that we control these narratives and that it's completely unjust and untoward to look at what we've done and what we've contributed to and say, I don't want to participate in the purchase of that product, which is not how commercial markets work. Suicide Squad, the failure of which conspiracy theorists bafflingly chalk up foremost to Sweet Baby's involvement and not, everything else about it, was a different story. This is because a consulting firm like Sweet Baby takes on different tasks to meet the needs of specific projects, undoubtedly true, which are dictated by those heading up said projects. Grant Roberts, who served as lead writer at Rocksteady from 2019 to 2021 before doing a stint in another studio and then joining Sweet Baby in 2023, told Aftermath that Sweet Baby didn't even come aboard Suicide Squad until the story was already locked in. By that point, Rocksteady mostly just needed Sweet Baby to help punch up background elements of the game's script and make the world feel more alive. On Suicide Squad, we wrote a lot of dumb barks for the world, a bunch of gags, but that's not really an interesting answer, right? Then conspiracy theorists have to figure out how game dev works to understand that the pipeline to put a pride flag in the game is actually quite different from the pipeline to adjust a character's sexuality and so on. There's so many different aspects of it, it's easier to just imagine the company I want to keep shadowy and mysterious did the bad thing. It's funny watching the shapes that people will twist themselves into, said Roberts, to be like, well, Sweet Baby is only a DEI place. They only do sensitivity reads. If it applies to this game that has a black character, but over here, Sweet Baby obviously wrote the entire story for Suicide Squad. You're wrong about everything. Again, I do think you can pull different thoughts and different threads from different people and make a worst actor kind of version of anybody that's arguing against you. I think that can happen in video games. I think that can happen in politics. I think that can happen in all the journalistic items we look at in Hangouts and Headlights. And I think it's bad every time, right? If you're just arguing with the worst portion of whatever group is arguing with you, then you aren't really engaging with their arguments. You aren't really discussing the topic at hand. You're just trying to pick somebody that you can beat on. And I think that's what's happening here. Video game, TV, and film companies seek out sensitivity readings and cultural consultants for reasons like this all the time. It's neither unusual nor surprising. The idea has been pushed several times that we are the reason Saga is black because they can't fathom that Remedy might want that for themselves, right? That they might have made that decision, written this character, given her an amazing story, and then come to us to say, go, hey, we want to make sure this rings true. Are there any aspects of the story that are not serving this character or feel incongruous with her background? Yeah, Saga Anderson is half Nordic, half the child of gods and monsters. So it's really difficult to say exactly what should be applied there. God of War Ragnarok is another example of Sweet Baby's more representation-focused work. Angrboda, who is black, exists in a world that does not share the racial history of America or other real-world nations. Members of Sweet Baby, alongside the game's narrative team, had to figure out how to weave in threads that would resonate with players who looked like Angrboda while also respecting the game's setting. And reasonable minds can differ as to whether you need the story of the gods of war and Nordic mythology to resonate with players who look like Angrboda when you decide to make her look like a little black girl. But realistically, the problem I have with God of War Ragnarok in this section is that the game takes a moment off to give you a 2-hour walking on a magical animal with Angrboda section that takes all narrative momentum away from whatever it is that you should be doing. My experience with the games that are referenced here, other than Alan Wake 2, is that when Sweet Baby Inc. gets involved, they tend to take these long sojourns to nowhere in order to either have that representation or to feel good about what is happening within one of these characters' lives that doesn't actually reflect on the story itself. That, I think, is a reasonable criticism of what they are putting into these games. I think you heard it at the end of the Kotaku article. If you want to criticize their storytelling, they're okay with it. I'm criticizing their storytelling here. And I think reasonable minds can criticize their storytelling. And reasonable minds can say, this is all being unfairly treated against Sweet Baby Inc. So I'm looking at this as a situation where people are not talking to each other. They're talking across each other. And this is similar to what happened, is my understanding, during Gamergate. But we'll talk about why that's a problem in a minute as well. In the game, she's not necessarily a black character because black does not mean the same thing in a fictional universe that it might mean in the real world, said Belair. There are a lot of things culturally you might see that are a part of a fraught history where you don't want to accidentally reference real world things in a way that feels too casual. But you also don't want to erase a perspective just because you are writing a fantasy world. So it's about finding that little space for it. Angrboda is a fine character. We liked Angrboda, but it is just a sojourn to nowhere for a long period of time in God of War Ragnarok story. You can hear us discuss that in the Bitcast. Sweet Baby and God of War's narrative team found that space and concerns that the studio had around Angrboda's place in the story of Atreus, Kratos' son. Angrboda kind of struggles in the story with this idea of, am I a part of someone else's story, said Belair. Initially, the team had concerns about whether that was something that should be exploring because it does feel like sidelining. Our thought was actually to lean into that concern and make it a part of her character because it is better for her to acknowledge it and have some agency than to pretend that's not the case and have it accidentally look as though the studio is just sidelining her. Despite the now commonly held belief that Sweet Baby stands the edges off games it comes into contact with, Belair said that as with God of War, Sweet Baby often encourages studios to do the opposite. We'll say, you've kind of gone too safe on this. When teams don't have representation on the team, they add some diversity to a game, but they're a little bit nervous about making that character too edgy because they're so worried about being offensive, said Belair. Often we'll come in and go, don't worry about it. Let's find ways to tell that story. We're not here to make games more boring or censored. Bringing in more perspectives allows you to push the envelope. And so you see both sides of this equation over and over again. Republican lawmakers in over 30 states have attempted to curtail companies' ability to implement DEI programs with things like the hilarious named Ron DeSantis-backed Stop Woke Act, which a federal appeals court recently blocked. DEI was also at the heart of former Harvard President Claudine Gay's recent resignation from her post following a bad faith congressional hearing about campus anti-Semitism. And that's, again, a reasonable minds can differ description of that she nonetheless could have handled better, and flimsy accusations of plagiarism. The anti-gay, meaning the person, movement's most powerful ringleader, hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackman, proclaimed that DEI was the real root cause of Harvard's problems immediately after Gay's ousting. Then his wife got hit with actually credible plagiarism accusations, and he didn't like that very much. I don't even think I need to even talk about how editorialized this paragraph is, right? think everybody can see that for themselves. The reality of DEI is both simpler and more complex than the right-wing panic makes it out to be. At DEI's core is the idea that in a society with deeply ingrained structural biases, simply avoiding active discrimination against marginalized people is not enough. DEI programs tend to focus on organizational matters like training, policies, and culture, which, per ABC, could mean implementing accessibility measures for people with disabilities, addressing discriminatory hiring practices and pay inequity, holding anti-bias trainings, and more. Companies also, of course, do this in service of capital. Research shows that diverse workforces are more profitable, and a million-dollar industry has sprung up around consulting and initiatives. DEI is an intuitive enough guiding principle, but research suggests that the implementation needs a lot of work. Some types of anti-bias training, for example, can actually reinforce people's biases, and it's generally difficult to change people's views and values with short-term interventions. DEI is often different and less effective than putting marginalized people in actual positions of power or funding businesses run by marginalized people. But where the panic around DEI is concerned, little of that matters. At this point, DEI is largely a square word. I don't even think it's a word. Just like woke, critical race theory, and countless other terms that have descended into the murky waters of meaninglessness. These words are so loosely applied that despite conspiracy adherents' claims, Sweet Baby isn't even a DEI firm. We're a narrative consultancy. We're not in charge of placements. We're not in charge of building teams. We don't get reached out to like, how should we hire people? Although, again, though, the truth is immaterial here. In the face of contradictory evidence, the conspiracy contorts into a wild new shape to maintain the structural integrity of its core. That's where the multi-trillion-dollar investment companies like BlackRock and Vanguard enter the picture. The basic, and to be clear, hilariously incorrect thinking is that these and other investment firms have rules around discrete ESG funds that focus on diversity. So companies bring on Sweet Baby to add diversity to their games in order to court life-changing investment sums. Because of this connection, Sweet Baby is able to wield outsized influence, and per one clip from a 2019 GDC talk Belair gave that's been taken massively out of context, terrify high-profile game studios into submission. Once again, that is just not how anything works. It's true that BlackRock and Vanguard rank among the top shareholders in companies like Microsoft, EA, and Take-Two. But ESG, or any kind of premeditated investment is absolutely not the reason why. One of the primary stores of wealth in this country is moms and pops putting their retirement and their savings into exchange-traded funds, typically the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ. Video game investor, producer, and author Matthew Ball told Aftermath. And I've referenced Matthew Ball in this space. He's a good resource, a good follow on Twitter for information about video games and other technological companies. When folks talk about Vanguard or BlackRock being the largest shareholder, they happen to be one of, if not the largest shareholders in nearly every company, in every airline, every hotel company, every oil and gas company, every gaming company. Because when a regular household wants to put $1,000 into the S&P 500, they buy that from Vanguard, and then Vanguard buys a percentage of the top 500 companies in America. That tends to include all of the major game publishers. Ball went on to explain that the whole point of firms like BlackRock and Vanguard is to avoid taking a principled stance or position. They buy a percentage of top companies, which is based on a calculation from S&P, not some kind of larger ideologically motivated plan. They don't take board seats. They don't meet with management. They don't express perspectives, Ball said. And that's broadly true. It's probably a little bit too strong because BlackRock and Vanguard have been activist investors in certain instances, some of which relate to ESG and DEI. BlackRock, Vanguard, and their ilk do offer ESG packages, or they have in the case of BlackRock, which recently scrapped the approach. These are intended to make ESG operations desirable to companies. So basically you, a normal person or a big spending investor, invest your money, and BlackRock or Vanguard spreads it out across various company stocks designated as ESG, good corporate citizens. But there are two glaringly large issues with the theory that a narrative consulting firm like Sweet Baby could factor into any of this. First off, when the conspiracy-addled mob is correct that Vanguard and BlackRock create rules and restrictions around which companies qualify for ESG investment, these tend to focus on equal employment opportunities where diversity is even concerned at all. Other ESG concerns are broader: a company's natural resources and land usage, conservation efforts, transparency around board rights, executive pay that's not completely out of control, and other things of the like. You see the editorializing here, right? Because these activist investors do control things like executive pay, but the editorializing is completely out of control. That's backing the Vanguard BlackRock side of things. The reason lines can differ as to whether BlackRock and Vanguard are good things on these capitalization tables. I would be surprised if there were any criteria such as in a video game, what's the relative screen time or character avatar concentration around ethnicity, said Ball. They're not going down to the individual product level with these companies. And I think that's largely right as well. The other issue Ball explained is that the ESG-related funds of companies like BlackRock and Vanguard are an itsy-bitsy slice of their overall pie. There's around $8.2 billion in Vanguard's ESG fund, for example, whereas it has over $1 trillion in general market holdings. For all intents and purposes, it's an immaterial ESG weight relative to the rest of it. And in those others, they have no criteria whatsoever. It's just, are you in the top 500? There are legitimate concerns about ESGs, says Aftermath, just as there are with DEI. It's not difficult for oil companies to qualify for ESG investment despite environmental being the first letter of the acronym. Meanwhile, if we're talking investment in general, research shows that it's failing marginalized game developers to a pretty remarkable degree. But again, that's not really the point of any of this. Very few people who believe the Sweet Baby conspiracy, perhaps zero, will read the above facts and come away with their minds changed because conspiracies are designed to metamorphose endlessly. This one in particular already has on several occasions, and it will likely continue to do so until its primary propagators get bored. But we're talking about many of the same names that stewarded Gamergate forward back in the day, specifically the ones who failed to use it as a stepping stone to bigger stages and have been hunting feverishly for something like this ever since. And they seem to be having a great time playing the hits, Gamers versus Media, Gamers Fighting Back, etc. On top of that, platforms like YouTube and Twitter incentivize leaning into the drama of the week, giving it larger than life moral stakes when creators are mostly just digging their heels in. So now, some of the creators to whom this conspiracy has filtered up are on their second round of videos reacting to interviews Sweet Baby has done this week while maintaining similar stances despite contradictory information. It's banal to say at this point, but on YouTube, a compelling narrative matters far more than accuracy. As long as the views keep coming in, this process will continue. Thank you for everybody watching this video, by the way. 350 of you, really appreciate it. The views keep coming in. This process will continue. I don't think that we need to just foment conspiracy theory, but I think we have to be careful about when we call things conspiracy theories. If folks want to believe in a conspiracy theory, that's kind of what they're going to do, said Belair. There's always going to find a reason to think we're not telling the truth, or that we are shadowy or mysterious, or that we're so powerful that we're able to just torpedo ourselves onto a project and make everything change. See, I think the key to understanding what's happening here is actually acknowledging that we can believe everything Sweet Baby says, every quote that they've given, everything that we've seen in Kotaku, and now in Aftermath, we'll see in The Guardian, and further on in this video, and still think that there's useful information to be communicated about when a consultancy like Sweet Baby Inc. is involved with the making of a video game or anything else. I think what we do is especially important to talk about in a world where most teams that ship a game get broken up or laid off or shuffled around internally. Our goal is to keep a team together, to keep a writer's room, a team of people who are really good at writing and narrative development. We can do a thing and then move on to another game and go, remember that thing? We can do something like that again, or we can use some of those learnings to avoid doing that thing again. Blair said that the Sweet Baby team has endured a lot of attempted doxings as well as all manner of other mob tactics, but so far their business hasn't suffered. They believe this is because, unlike when Gamergate first popularized many of the tactics now depressingly employed by every online movement, the video game industry has become pretty used to this kind of thing. It's not fun and it's certainly not good for anybody's mental health, but it doesn't cause people and companies to run for the hills either. On the contrary, many have stuck around to help. We have people that we know and trust that have been through this kind of thing and helped us to be more safe in terms of treatment and prevention, said Roberts. Our clients have been enormously supportive, often because they have been targeted by the same groups in the past, said Belair. We're all in this sometimes terrible industry together. And this is from Nathan Grayson, who was a name that appeared during the Gamergate situation back in, I think, 2014. It's before this channel started. So apologies if I get any of that history wrong, folks that know it better than me. And here's an article in The Guardian. It's 10 years now since Gamergate. The industry must now stand up to far-right trolls. Conspiracy theorists are still routinely targeted and abusing women and woke game consultants. With a small studio currently under fire, the games industry silence is deafening. 10 years ago, a game developer's aggrieved ex-boyfriend published a vindictive screed accusing her of trading sex for favorable reviews of her indie game. This was leapt upon by the least savory corner of the 2014 internet, 4chan, and kicked off a harassment campaign that broadened to include all women working in video game development or the gaming press, as well as the industry's LGBTQ plus community. Sensing blood in the water, alt-right agitators on YouTube and Steve Bannon's Breitbart jumped on the bandwagon and soon began to steer it, and Gamergate, as this manufactured outrage became known, mutated into one of the first fronts of the modern culture wars driven by social media misogyny and the weaponized disaffection of young men. Many of its tactics became part of the Trump election playbook. I do want to mention that I had pause to even making this video because I did not want to be a part of culture warring, right? I think you can look at what Sweet Baby Inc. does and say, you know, I don't love that there are all these sojourns and meandering plots and tokenism that appear in Spider-Man 2, God of War Ragnarok, and to a much lesser extent in Alan Wake 2. I don't want those things in my narratives. And regardless of what that meandering might be towards, whether it's right-wing politics, left-wing politics, or otherwise, I don't want it in the narratives that I'm experiencing in my video games, movies, or television. And that in and of itself is a legitimate criticism that can be communicated and not automatically become Gamergate 2.0. I don't want to be in the culture war, folks. I don't want this channel to be in the culture war. I know that Reset Era already thinks that this channel is Gamergate adjacent because I'm not willing to throw out every argument that's ever been made for Gamergate or Sweet Baby Inc. out with the bathwater, as it were. But I don't want to be fomenting any of the flames of culture war out on the internet. And I think the folks that are in this community that watch a video like this one can see that there are reasonable people that can have positions that say, it's interesting for me to know when a consulting group like this is involved in a company, because I can take that into account when I'm deciding what to spend my hard-earned dollars on, and not be a Trump election playbook, anti-woke, alt-right agitator, or whatever other description the Guardian might put on them. This week, a 16-person narrative design studio has found itself at the center of conspiracy theory that holds it responsible for the insidious prevalence of wokery in modern video games. A group with more than 200,000 followers on PC game storefront Steam. We'll talk about that number in a second. We saw it referenced in Aftermath about how that number went up after Sweet Baby Inc. did some things, as well as thousands in a Discord chat channel, believes that Sweet Baby Inc. is secretly forcing game developers to change the bodies, ethnicities, and sexualities of video game characters to conform to woke ideology. And again, I would hesitate to say that any given group of 200,000 people plus thousands on Discord has a belief of any kind, but certainly one that puts them in the worst light, I think is just kind of a dereliction of journalistic duty when we talk about how these things are described, right? And these are the articles that ultimately led me to making this video. We'll see the ones that actually jumped out at me and why I wanted to make this video to discuss this topic with you. But as someone that deeply believes in the importance of journalism and getting news out there and information so that people can make their own decisions on these things, the rampant editorializing on this particular topic was just something that raised my alarm bells to their fullest degree. So when you see this, I would never ascribe a group of 200,000 people with any belief, let alone one like this. Sweet Baby Inc. is secretly forcing game developers to change their things. I don't think is something that is reflective of certainly every one of the 200,000, but maybe not even the leadership of a group like that. They think that Sweet Baby has written and controlled almost every popular video game of the past 5 years, shutting straight white men out. As Trump once again heads out on the campaign trail, this is part of a broader far-right panic about diversity and inclusion that has already resulted in proposed regressive anti-women and anti-woke legislation in the US and elsewhere. The fight against Sweet Baby Inc. is directly related to the Trump election campaign and anti-woke legislation. I mean, you're making leaps here. The agency in question has, of course, done nothing of the sort. It is simply a narrative development studio, the video game equivalent of script doctors, that works with game developers to ensure their plots make sense and their characters aren't embarrassingly out of touch, to try to ensure. The consultancy's mission statement is to make games more engaging, more fun, more meaningful, and more inclusive. And again, generally speaking, when we describe what a business does, what a company does, we don't take their mission statement as fact. We say, okay, that's what you're aimed at, but what have you actually done in reality? What have you been involved with? How has that affected things? It cannot dictate that developers feature, for example, Black female leads in their games. 10 years ago, it was female games journalists and critics in the firing line. This time, it's narrative designers. But the conspiracist's message is the same. Diversity has no place in games. If you are a woman, queer, or a person of color working in this industry, you should expect the worst. Nathan Grayson of Aftermath and Alyssa Mercante of Kotaku have both investigated the origins and sprawling nature of the Sweet Baby conspiracy theory. Those are the two articles we just read. Its proponents draw preposterous connections between the consultancy and BlackRock and the funding crisis affecting the wider games industry. This is far from the first time since Gamergate that such harassment has spilled over. What harassment? Such harassment relating to the sprawling nature of the conspiracy, consultancy, and BlackRock. Those are just in the articles. They didn't even include any quotes or reference pictures that suggest that that's even happening, let alone that those connections would be harassment. But we'll talk about that much more, I promise. Depressingly coordinated abuse against game developers is now somewhat routine, especially if they do something so audacious as to include pride flags in Spider-Man's Manhattan or take their time implementing mod support for Baldur's Gate 3. A full 91% of devs surveyed by the Game Developer Conference last year said that harassment from players was an issue, 42% calling it a very serious issue. Now, I highlighted this sentence because if you're looking at this paragraph in the context of these articles, you see that this is a complete non sequitur, right? This isn't discussing Sweet Baby Inc. at all. This is saying that gamers are sometimes harassers. There's sometimes problems for the developers of video games. I have no doubt that that is the case. I can tell you I get harassing DMs. I get bad reviews on my law firm for videos that I do on these particular topics in this space. That is undoubtedly true, but that doesn't make this specific case that you're trying to make in this article true. This is just using a stat to try to buffer your position that has nothing to do with your position. When Gamergate was going on, the silence from much of the video games industry was deafening. Instead of standing up for the people that were being targeted, almost everyone who wasn't being directly attacked by Gamergate's mob stuck their fingers in their ears and tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Media outlets, game developers, and publishers alike, perhaps motivated by a fear of making things worse or of alienating what they feared was a sizable part of their audience, failed to speak out in defense of women until it was too late, if they spoke out at all. IGN, then the most popular games website in the world, is it not right now? I think it still is, published a stunningly weak exercise in both sidesism about recent unpleasantness that failed to even call the movement by its name. Okay. In the 10 years since Gamergate, the culture wars that were fermented in gamer forums have spread out to poison almost all aspects of our lives. I do agree that the culture wars are not a great time for anybody. The last decade has taught us that these people will simply not go away. There may always be those who believe that the mere presence of women and minorities in their video games or their Star Wars or their halls of cultural or political power is an affront, a symptom of the woke mind virus. And you have to take the irony here in note, right, in this paragraph. The last decade has taught us that these people, those people, will not simply go away. This is a discussion of whether or not representation matters, right? Whether diversity should be included, whether the people that are arguing against it have any point whatsoever. And the main thesis statement here from The Guardian is those people just won't go away. Imagine that coming from the other side. It's a very interesting kind of stance to take on this. Individual developers are braver these days about speaking out on social media. The director of Alan Wake 2, one of them, posted that conspiracy theories claiming Sweet Baby forced the developer to change a character's ethnicity were absolutely not true. And Mary Kenny, associate narrative director at Marvel's Spider-Man, developer Insomniac Games, has also tweeted strong denials. She might have, but if we go and we link to this, we'll see that they are no longer available to be seen by anyone that's not following her. So we actually have to go find another article to discuss that. We'll get back to that in a minute. Nobody is forcing diversity into video games. It is happening naturally as players and developers themselves diversify. Gamergate didn't intimidate women out of video games 10 years ago, and we won't be intimidated now. The games industry knows that a greater breadth of content featuring a greater breadth of characters made with the contributions of a greater breadth of people is good for creativity and for business, no matter what some aggrieved gamers may think. And this is the second part of this article that's just hard to kind of reconcile, right? We know the gaming industry is going through a contraction. We know that layoffs are happening every other minute. We expect more in this March 2024 because it's the end of a fiscal year for some companies and the end of a quarter for others. And yet the game industry knows that all of this is good for business is an open question mark because business isn't great right now. And I think that's mostly because it was of overhiring and overgrowth during the pandemic. But a reasonable mind could come in here and say the games that are being made on some real axis are not satisfying the gamer base. And that in of itself is a problem for any consumer industry, right? And when all this was coming up, a number of articles popped in that made me decide to make this video. And I asked a couple of days ago, I'm seeing that my timeline is covered in this stuff. I may wind up doing a video talking about it. Let me know if you'd be interested. And a number of you said essentially you wouldn't because you didn't see a legal angle and there's too much culture war stuff and it's a bit too toxic. And so I wanted to comment on that as we go through here. I liked everybody that commented on this. I think it was a great conversation. I love getting feedback from all of you on X or through the community posts. But what made me decide to do this video was a series of articles that I saw come out pretty recently, and they were titled things like this from PC Gamer. A company called Sweet Baby Inc. has become the target of anti-woke gamers because it offers consultancy work, an industry standard service that's been normal for years. And here we have that kind of traditional hangouts and headlines editorializing, right? Is this why Sweet Baby Inc. has become a target of anti-woke gamers? Because it offers consultancy work? No, obviously not. Because consultancy work is an industry standard service that's been normal for years. That's not really the fight here. What we're talking about is what kind of consultancy work they do and what it signals about the games that they are helping to consult on, right? Consultants, not tyrants. So you get this kind of reflexive journalistic echo chamber where you have Kotaku and some others comment on the fact that some people believe that they're forcing diversity and representation, which I don't think most reasonable actors in this space think, right? You think publishers and developers want to go in that direction, and Sweet Baby Inc. is the tool, the method by which they do that. And so it's useful to know when Sweet Baby Inc. is involved if you think that they're not doing well with the stories that they make. I tend to think that they don't. But again, Alan Wake 2, Spider-Man 2, very different games. And this is PC Gamer talking about these things. So I saw this. I said, that's not the right way to talk about this particular issue. And then I saw Eurogamer, which is a site that I actually really like. I like the journalists at Eurogamer. I give quotes to them quite often. Did an article on this entitled Spider-Man, Alan Wake, Ridiculous Fishing Devs Speak Up in Support of Consultancy Studio Sweet Baby Inc. And they said, to recap, Sweet Baby Inc. recently became the target of a group which claimed the company was forcing studios it worked with to increase diversity within its games and accused it of pushing a woke agenda in the industry. Following a report into the claims by Kotaku, and every article really links back to that Kotaku article, a number of game developers have spoken up to clear up misconceptions about what companies like Sweet Baby Inc. actually do. Kenny, who has written for games including Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, Telltale's The Walking Dead, and the upcoming Marvel's Wolverine, posted a thread on X yesterday. That's the one that we can't see right now. Some of you don't seem to understand how narrative consulting on games works, she began, but don't worry, I do. During a game development, narrative consultants will be hired by studios to help with fleshing out or tweaking narrative elements, Kenny said. Narrative consultants do not get final say, Kenny reiterated. It doesn't get into the game if we as the developer don't approve it. They consult. They do research, pitch ideas, give feedback, and maybe even write scripts. But none of that gets into the game unless the core dev team agrees with it. I'm going to keep saying that because it's key. Sweet Baby is not, nor is any consulting group, coming in to wreck games. They're helping smooth out plots and deepen characters. They ease the burden on the core narrative team. They're additive in every way. And again, this I see as essentially the wrong kind of defense. These are people talking over each other, right? Because somebody that has a problem with Sweet Baby Inc., as we've said a number of times in this video already, could look at it as a signal of what the developer and publisher wants to do. They don't need to be controlling things to still be useful to know when they're involved in something like this. Indie developer and consultant Rami Ishmael backed up points made by Kenny, adding in his own post that as a consultant, you must understand your work is advisory and your position is easily eliminated, which is absolutely true and is a useful kind of data point to have here, but it's why consultants are generally accused of doing what the client wants more than offering good pushback or good advice if it doesn't already match up with what those clients want. So yeah, Sweet Baby Inc. is involved in things that these companies already want to do, but that in of itself is useful information. And then they talk a little bit about Spider-Man 2. And I saw this article and said to myself, in a kind of Hangouts and Headlines standpoint, that these are people that are arguing with each other and aren't listening to each other's arguments. And that was what caused me to say, I think I might want to do a video on this. And then this came out yesterday and basically cemented that I was going to do this video. Game Developer, which is an industry-facing website, says, why are Valve and Discord permitting harassment against Sweet Baby Inc.? And this obviously has editorializing in it, most predominantly that Valve and Discord are permitting harassment, right? We don't know what exactly this refers to. We have to read the article to see, but that raised my question marks because one of the things that people said in the tweet that I asked about was there doesn't seem to be a legal angle on this. I don't want to talk about it if it doesn't have some kind of legal angle. And so I think we need to talk about what harassment is, because if we look at this on its face, we see an article from Bryant Francis here that says, why are Valve and Discord permitting harassment against Sweet Baby Inc.? And saying, well, this group is harassing this narrative consultancy. And if we were to really treat this in the same way as Bryant Francis is going to in his article, we'd say, why is Game Developer harassing Valve and Discord? Right? This is essentially objecting to the way a company is doing something, just like people are objecting to the way Sweet Baby Inc. is doing something. And you get to this situation where narrative consultancy group Sweet Baby Inc. has become the target of an online harassment campaign. Where does this link go? The Kotaku article. For its consulting work on games like Alan Wake 2, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Why? The answer is frustratingly hard to put down into words. In fact, we've already spent an hour talking about it. Users on websites like Twitter and Kiwi Farms, a site known for organizing sometimes violent harassment campaigns, operating under the name Sweet Baby Inc. Detected, have singled out the agency for allegedly having overarching influence on these games and accused of it of forcibly injecting a political agenda into them by advocating for diversity. And again, I think the worst actors, there probably are people that think this. I do not agree with that. I don't think they're forcing these things. I think they are a symptom, not a cause. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to just fight the worst actors on either side of these arguments. While the studio's contributions happen mostly on a micro level, contributing story feedback, helping workshop narrative beats, and writing flavor text and barks with the lens of inclusivity in mind, their work has been reframed as shoehorning Black or LGBTQ characters into games for which they were not originally designed, sometimes through intimidation. It's a grim conspiracy theory built on out-of-context comments and a deliberate misreading of their mission statement, as well as racism, homophobia, and other layers of bigotry. Wow. In an interview with game developer Sweet Baby Inc. CEO Kim Belair's, said the harassment they've been experiencing started bubbling in October 2023 around the release of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 and Alan Wake 2, with the worst hate coming from users on 4chan, Kiwi Farms, and Twitter. Twitter was the worst until recently, she noted. In the last few weeks, however, the harassment grew stronger after the groups spun up a Steam Curation page and Discord server to organize and spread their conspiracy theories. Despite that increased spike, Valve and Discord have allowed the curation page and server to remain online. Posts from the group's moderators indicate the companies have warned them that content on their platforms may result in their being removed, forcing them to take some additional moderation steps, but still leaving them online. Why? Both platforms have made it clear that they don't want to be used as vectors for harassment, but slippery language in their terms of service has enabled bad actors to turn their platforms from ones where developers do business to ones where developers can be targeted for abuse. Now, the links already are editorialized, right? Slippery language in their terms of service. But let's take a look at what these link to, what they're even referring to when we have this discussion. First, we have, let's see here if I can find where we went there. First, we have the Steam community group section that we read already. Then we have the limitations on harassment that we looked at earlier in the video. And then I want to point out that the Steam subscriber agreement in and of itself is entered into by each party under the laws of the state of Washington in the United States. So when you enter into a contract in the United States, you enter into it under a certain state's laws, generally one that has some relation to one of the parties. In this case, Steam is headquartered in Washington. So the contract is under Washington laws. So when we talk about why isn't Valve or Steam doing anything about harassment, it's incumbent upon us to figure out what harassment actually is. So we can look at Washington law. Technically speaking, a contract is different from a statute. But when you don't define terms, like Steam doesn't define the term harassment in its community guidelines or things of that nature, we can be informed helpfully by what the law of the land is under the contract term. So we see in Washington, a person is guilty of harassment if the person knowingly threatens to cause bodily injury, to cause physical damage to the property of a person, to subject the person threatened or any other person to physical confinement or restraint, or maliciously to do any other act which is intended to substantially harm the person threatened or another with respect to his or her physical health or safety, and the person by words or conduct places the person threatened in reasonable fear that the threat will be carried out. So harassment is pretty specific. You really have to be threatening to restrain or hurt somebody to be under harassment. That doesn't appear to be the case when we look at the Steam group. There might be other issues within the forum. There might be other issues with the excuse me, apologies. I have too many tabs open, as somebody just pointed out. We reached out to Valve and Discord multiple times to ask how a group using their platform to target a company was within the bounds of their terms of service. No answer back yet. But we already said in the Steam terms of service, it talks about users, it talks about people, it talks about Steam personnel. It doesn't really talk about companies out there in the world because you wouldn't expect it to. But it assumes that there's harassment. It also assumes that this is slippery language. Again, you don't want to overly grab what is just talking about things and prohibit them on your forums. You want people to be conversing on your platform, whether you're Steam or Discord. You don't want to be helping people violate the law, of course, but I'm not sure any of the language we saw in the Steam document was slippery so much as just open to interpretation. They might be able to use a definition of harassment, but you'd be worried that whatever they define it as would be too narrow for something and that bad actors would be operating outside that language anyway. So by not defining it, the folks like Steam and Discord are actually allowing themselves more power to police this than less. And so I don't see that as a good criticism here. But if we look at that Steam, we can look at Discord, if we can find that. We see Discord is operating under California law. They also ban harassment generally, harassing through our services, etc. And we look under California law and we see harassment is unlawful violence, a threat of violence, or a knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person that seriously alarms, annoys, or harasses the persons. That's right. This particular statute by the California legislature says harassment is something that harasses. Law, folks, get into it. And that serves no legitimate purpose. But we're not going to tell you what a legitimate purpose is. The course of conduct must be that which would cause a reasonable person to suffer substantial emotional distress and must actually cause substantial emotional distress to the petitioner. So harassment is, generally speaking, it's violence, of course, but it is a threat of violence that causes substantial emotional distress to the listener. And that is something that could possibly apply to some of the stuff we've seen or described in these articles. We don't actually have examples to go off of here. And again, this is so big and kind of giant and metastasizing, as some of these articles say, that it's impossible to research fully. But I have not personally seen messages of a harassing nature coming from the anti-Sweet Baby Inc. forces in this particular topic. Now, I say that because I have, when we look at more of this story, seen a little bit more things that are closer to harassment coming from the Sweet Baby Inc. side of the equation. So this is an article from the Shortcut. I don't know the Shortcut. I don't know their background here, but I do know they captured a couple of tweets that I wanted to reference that I saw past my timeline a couple of days ago that are now gone. What started the Sweet Baby Inc. backlash? The controversy began after a Sweet Baby Inc. employee, Chris Kindred, highlighted a Steam Curator group called Sweet Baby Inc. detected on X. Kindred has since deleted these posts, but they've been documented below. Kindred accused the group of harassment, tagging the creator in Steam, and said even with the discriminatory language filed off, the group itself fails the code of conduct. And I don't see that. I've looked at the Steam code of conduct. I don't see it failing that. Chris Kindred says the Steam Curator harassment group Sweet Baby Inc. detected is led by this person and then linked to that person. Here's them trying to be slick so they don't get reported. Even with the discriminatory language filed off, the group itself still fails the code of conduct. Kindred then asked their followers to report the F out of this group and to report the creator since he loves his account so much. In other words, trying to get his account banned, the account through which he purchased products on Steam, because of this quote unquote harassment. Report the F out of this group, etc. And that appears to be one of the nexus points in the last little while for when this group became so big. If you actually look what is linked in this Twitter, and I don't think we can get it big enough from this particular section, you'll see that the group itself was not as big as it is now when this went out. And this is a Sweet Baby Inc. affiliated person. And so you get into these arguments about who started what, right? Felix at home at Lego Butts on Twitter says Steam doesn't have guidelines for curators that would prevent someone from starting a curation group that focuses on, say, Sweet Baby Inc. and warns people to not buy games they're associated with, which could just list any game at all. And again, there hasn't been reference to any games that Sweet Baby Inc. isn't associated with that I saw when looking at this particular site. Doesn't mean you have to agree with what they're doing here. It does make it not harassment when you just say a tracker for games involved with Sweet Baby Inc., etc. And if you're Sweet Baby Inc., you put those games on your website, right? Sweet Baby Inc. shows their games, and some articles say, well, then what's the point of the curation group? And it can still be a point of bringing information closer to the purchasing point, right? You still want to make it less frictionful. You see this all the time with game developers and platforms that are selling video games to have this information out there. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to think this is a valid form of criticism. You can love what Sweet Baby Inc. does, but just saying Sweet Baby Inc. worked on these games that you're otherwise advertising on your site doesn't in and of itself make this particular curation group harassment. And so that's where we get into this discussion. Why are you allowing it to be harassment? Because if I'm Valve or I'm Discord, I'm looking at this and saying, I don't see harassment here. And I can't just start killing people off my site for reasons that essentially are just based on pure editorializing. Community and discovery tools gone awry, says Game Developer.com. When word of the curation group Sweet Baby Inc. detected first surfaced on social media, it seemed like a joke. What was the point of making a curation page detecting games that a consulting company worked on, especially when the games are listed on their site? The answer, unfortunately, goes back to how conspiracy theories spread rapidly in the age of internet. And again, they go all in with this kind of conspiracy notion of what's happening here and says all of these are harassment on Discord and on Steam. And I'm not going to tell you sitting here on this video that there aren't some kind of harassing posts in either of those locations. But when you bring up that these particular groups are trying to talk to their forum members and saying, don't harass, don't do these things that could get us kicked off of this site, then that isn't indicative of a group that is trying to harass or otherwise violate the rules. Excuse me. Okay. Discord here. Finally, I just wanted to talk about a few things that popped up in the last couple of hours or couple of days. This is Dave Bedard on LinkedIn saying, for the past 4 months, my company, Sweet Baby Inc., has been targeted by a far-right harassment campaign conspiracy theory. This is a tough situation for me, my co-founder, Kim Belair, our entire team, and our collaborators. More than the frustrations caused by the harassment and the precautions we're putting in place as a result of that, the toughness comes from the fact that this entire campaign is based on misinformation. Misinformation so wild and left field, or right field, I guess, that it's impossible to even engage with it to combat it. So we spoke with press to clear things up about exactly what we do and how we do it. That's some of the articles that we saw in this little press tour. Adding our voices to this conversation felt necessary because what is happening to us is something that has happened before in this industry and will happen again. It happens to not just us, but also to countless other devs, players, journalists, and creators. Everyone who has reached out to me with kind words of support has also asked me what they can do to help, and it took me a while to find an answer to the question, but I think I finally know. This is what you can do to help. Check in on your marginalized colleagues and friends in this industry. Make sure they're okay. Let them know that they are loved, that they are appreciated, that they are welcome, that they are talented. Tell them you're not going to let this kind of hate push them out of this industry. Tell them that things like this won't scare all of their community away, that they are protected and that they have a place here now more than ever. I'd be really grateful if you did that. I really don't have a problem with this message from the CEO or co-founder at Sweet Baby Inc. I think it's important to be kind to others. I think it's important to communicate to others that they are wanted and welcome in various environments. I don't think that saying, maybe I don't think this company is very good at their job, is harassment. And I don't have a strong feeling about Sweet Baby Inc. But for those that do, I don't think that it's fair to necessarily lump everybody together into the, we think that having a black woman in a game should not be allowed kind of species of critique. After the links went out about getting the individual that started Sweet Baby Inc. detected to lose their account happened, the individual that was responsible for that got their account blocked on X for what amounted to personalized harassment. And so it's a big fight, just like Gamergate, about what's actually happening in the world. And now we have other things happening, like Take This, which is a group that is designed around facilitating mental health in video games, calling this directly Gamergate 2 and having an entire article about responding to Gamergate 2. And this individual, Dr. Rachel Cohort, who I saw on my timeline last night, has since protected her posts. And so you can't interact with those directly, but you can go to the Take This website and you can look at this Responding to Gamergate 2 article. And it says, if you're reading this, you've probably been hearing about what's now being called Gamergate 2. It's the latest targeted harassment campaign within the game industry, and it's aimed at Sweet Baby Inc., a Montreal-based narrative development studio. The campaign also has been impacting entities and games associated with Sweet Baby, journalists covering the issue, and others associated in various ways with the targets. You may be at a loss to know how to talk about this issue and what, if anything, you can do about it. That's where we come in. Discord, Steam, and X have been the predominant platforms where the abuse and harassment has been taking place. In these spaces, lists of game studios, companies, and associated organizations are being circulated for targeting by members of the mob. Large-scale harassment campaigns like this fuel and are fueled by political events. As political rhetoric heats up ahead of the US presidential election later this year, this kind of online activity is going to ramp up, and it's important to understand that these phenomena are interrelated. As scholars and journalists have noted, the targeted harassment, hate, and cultural norms that were at the heart of Gamergate in the mid-2010s never went away. People in game spaces, especially marginalized developers and content creators, face hate and harassment daily. In fact, research conducted by Take This has outlined an entire spectrum and typology of extremism and dark participation in games that is bigger than any one movement but underlies all of them. It can be scary or uncomfortable to think about, to talk about, and to understand. In overwhelming situations, it's not unusual to feel at a loss or to have thoughts of helplessness, but there are things we can do to mitigate the harm. So again, this is being treated, this discussion of Sweet Baby Inc., as if it is a major political and sociological event. It's extremely important to speak out and step up for folks who are being harmed. This kind of support can take on many different forms. This could be an email or quick check-in with people in your orbit who are targets of the harassment or are close to those targets. Family members, colleagues, and friends of those targeted also experience different types of harm in these situations. And look, as someone that's been online for years now, talking about various issues in gaming and otherwise, I am familiar with online harassment. It's no fun. Absolutely check in with those people that are being harassed, that are being discussed in a way that they don't like, and make sure that they're okay. But this might be going a little bit too far with what we just discussed in these articles. So this is one of those issues where conspiracy theories beget conspiracy theories, in my experience. And Gamergate 2, probably not a justified name for what this is, but Gamergate 1 might not have been a justified name for what that was. During organized harassment campaigns, people sometimes are forced to leave social media and online activity for a time, which I did highlight because, again, can't get to these because Dr. Rachel Cohort left. Oh, yes. I'm just not drinking my tea properly, honey. Thank you so much. Because she did have to protect her posts. So that is both slightly ironic. And if you're thinking that this is an accurate description of what is happening, a little bit scary. People of marginalized identities often already have some of these tools in place out of historical necessity, but the volume of large campaigns like this can be quickly overwhelming. There's a games hotline website and a digital safety guide. For industry leaders, you may be inclined to be quiet or cautious, but that's actually not helpful. I find caution is generally always helpful. As noted in our resource, Empowering the Game Industry, a major lesson learned from Gamergate was the importance of taking a loud public stance. At the time, many studios were hesitant to address the hate and abuse from Gamergate in any meaningful way. I will stand here or sit here and take a loud public stance. To the extent that harassment is happening, violent threats or otherwise are happening, I stand against them. But I do not think that that means we should just eliminate all ability to critique what is happening within the game's creation process. Do not harass, do not threaten, whether it's violent or otherwise. Death threats are never okay. Harassment is not useful to whatever your position is, but you can 100% critique and offer valid criticisms of whatever media you are consuming, enjoying, or not. And I do think that that distinction should be made when we have these conversations, because I think it's very easy to lump in people with the worst elements of whatever is happening. A major lesson learned from Gamergate was the importance of taking a loud public stance. At the time, many studios were hesitant to address the hate and abuse from Gamergate in any meaningful way. Hate and abuse is wrong. The reasons varied, but usually this hesitation was born out of fear of losing profits or concern that taking a stance would attract the attention of the Gamergate mob. The quote is, "The thinking went, we want to protect our community from Gamergate. So by being silent, we will avoid inviting the pro-Gamergate crowd to our forums and into our community." However, the failure to take a stand and clearly communicate with the community backfired. Without an explicit statement from the studio that toxic, misogynistic behavior was not welcome, the studio found that pro-Gamergate individuals assumed the studio's game was a safe space for them to build a community. All right, I will tell you folks in the community who I think already know this, that toxic, misogynistic behavior, ad hominems of any kind, misandrous, misogynistic, racist, or otherwise, is not welcome here. Reasonable minds can differ. We can absolutely have conversations with each other on important topics, even those that touch politics or other important things to us. And that is a useful thing to have on the internet and in this space. So 100%, here's an explicit statement. That behavior is not welcome here. And so I hope that everybody can continue to keep their thinking caps on and have good and informed discussions about these important topics that mean so much to so many people. In other words, failure to clearly and unequivocally denounce Gamergate and the harassment and abuse done in its name created a space for that hate and abuse to flourish, spread, and become normalized. And yeah, I think this is, again, stealing a base, right? You can denounce harassment and abuse, but that doesn't make every single aspect of a broader movement wrong or right? We can have things that are largely correct or incorrect, and then have aspects of them that are the opposite. Harassment and abuse, always wrong. Hate, harassment, and toxic behavior have no place in games. By taking direct, targeted action in a timely manner, we can mitigate further harm to talented, dedicated folks in games and help prevent additional recurrences of these harmful events. So, yes, I hope I was clear there. I am sure some people will take this video and already decide that I am in favor of harassment or otherwise equivocating on the nature of Gamergate 2, as it were. But I think it's important to have nuance and understanding when arguments like this are happening, even in the midst of a lack of institutional trust and misinformation and everything else that happens online or otherwise. So that's why I made this video. I wanted to talk about harassment. I was actually kind of brought to a certain amount of ire by this headline in and of itself. Permitting harassment is assuming your premise, and you never really establish it in your article. And instead, we look at legal definitions and say, I don't see anything that's obviously harassment. The closest thing, in my opinion, is actually the Sweet Baby Inc. developer that says, take away this guy's account, report him, and make sure that he loses the access to his games he has. That's the closest that I see to harassment, because it is at least a loss of property, if not violent or otherwise physical threat. And that's the closest. I don't really think either side is harassing each other here. And I think reasonable minds can have that conversation without diving deep into that particular puddle of goo. But that's why I wanted to do this video. And as I say that, I want to remind myself to check the super chats, the memberships, and otherwise, and make sure that I get to each and every one of you. You guys have been talking a lot in the chat, I have seen, and I thank you so much for all of it. Here's the Longhouse Gaming Podcast. Thank you for having a discussion about this Hoeg. Regardless of what side you're on, we need to talk about the pros and cons of DEI consultant groups. Sure, and we need to talk about whether or not Sweet Baby Inc. qualifies as one. We can talk about the pros and cons of consultancies of all types. One of the issues with consultants, as I framed in this video, is that they will go and do what you tell them to do. Consultants of all stripes in all businesses have that particular issue, and it all stems from what the underlying company wants to have happen. Rami Ishmael is exactly right that says a consultancy is easily fired, and so they want to be yes men for the most part. And that is apparently what's happening here. And that's a discussion point to be had about Sony or Insomniac or Sony Santa Monica or Remedy or whoever else is interacting with this particular company. But it isn't solely on Sweet Baby Inc. or any other consultancy or company that works with these companies. It might just be a symptom rather than a cause. So we can absolutely have the discussion. I think it's worthwhile, but there aren't easy answers to these things. That's why they keep coming up. Shell, thank you so much for gifting 5 Hoeg Law memberships during this video. I really appreciate it. All of those things make this channel possible to have these conversations with you, to have these conversations in places like the comments. Please do like, subscribe, leave those comments if you're interested in those. I'd like to have good conversations here about topics of interest like this one. So thank you so much. Shireen also as a member for 16 months, thanking Shell. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Shell, again. Love this channel and its chat, says Shireen. I really appreciate it. And Midnight Fury, thank you for gifting a Hoeg Law membership yourself. I really appreciate it. I always love that picture of the cat. So thank you so much. Britt in the chat, thank you so much for the super chat. I can use any excuse not to buy a product. It is not organic. It was directed or stars someone I don't like. It was written by some hack, or it was touched by, as Britt says, Stinky Baby Diapers Inc. My money, my choice, LOL. And ultimately, that's where a lot of this comes to, right? You have the open question with Sweet Baby Inc. of, why did you respond so strongly to a Steam curation group that says Sweet Baby Inc. detected, when ordinarily, if you're a small consultancy and you're associated with these huge big name games, you want the industry to know that that's in fact the case. In fact, one of the things I negotiate in my contracts all the time is the right of publicity. Whether or not a vendor has the right to say, I'm associated with this bigger company that you might know well, or whether in the alternative, the other company has the right to say they're working with you, the vendor, because they like that association for some reason. And we negotiate those terms primarily to be mutual, that both sides can use it or both sides can't. But that's a discussion all the time, because a lot of smaller companies want to be associated with the bigger companies, want to be associated with the more predominant brands. And so on its face, again, I look at a site like Sweet Baby Inc. detected, and that doesn't in and of itself offend the conscience of someone looking at it from afar. It's really only when you raise this other stink, as it were, and you create 200,000 followers of this curation group, that all of this happens. So it really takes two to tango to have a fight like this one. Lucius Augustus, you hit it on the head. Gamergate all over again. Thank you, Lucius Augustus. I really appreciate it. I don't know that this is Gamergate all over again, but again, I wasn't involved in the conversation during Gamergate. You have videos in this space of me discussing that particular point in time. And you have, as I said, various aspects of the internet, including Reset Era, say that my association with Last Stand Media or some of the videos I've done on this site make me Gamergate adjacent or other things like that. And while I don't think that's applicable, you can have different people say, I don't want to listen to Hoeg. I don't want to work with him because he doesn't say the things I want him to say about Gamergate or Sweet Baby Inc. And that's entirely justified. I don't view that as harassment. You don't want my content because you think that it is harmful in some way. That's up to you. That is on you. Reasonable minds can differ on these points. And I'm happy to have that conversation. Hedgehog in Space, thank you for being a member for 16 months. Thanks for everything you do, says the Hedgehog in Space. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate that. Joe Munger says, show me all these reasonable actors. I assume you're referring to the anti-Sweet Baby Inc. side of things. I will show you all these reasonable actors when somebody shows me all of the harassing actors. I mean, when we read through all those articles, I tried to read through as much as possible while keeping this video under 2 hours long. And at not any point did I see anything except the kind of bald-faced assertion that harassment was happening. It really seemed to be the notion that we saw in the GameDeveloper.com article that the existence of the group was harassment in and of itself. You don't have that kind of second level where somebody's threatening something or otherwise. And in the absence of that, I have to assume that everything in it is set up otherwise is straw men. I can't just grant you your editorialized description of what's happening, because to do so is to grant you your argument in its entirety. And I want to see those things. If people are harassing, let me see them. Let me denounce them. I'm not in favor of harassment here, but I didn't see them. And so it makes it a very difficult thing to discuss. It's one of those things where I actually talked with other people behind the scenes about even making this video. And part of the conversation was, yeah, I think that there are important things to say there, Rick, but it is hard to separate out from the bad actors. I agree with that, but I don't ever want that to let me stop, hopefully informing, educating, and being useful on the internet in this space. Bill Still, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Thank you as always, us, for your thoughtful analysis and great insight. You rock. Thank you, Bill. That is very nice of you to say. I try to rock. Sometimes I succeed. Sometimes I fail. Britt, thank you for the super chat. Why do you have so few tabs open? If you had another 1,000 tabs, you could find everything faster. LOL. Yeah, I knew I had a lot of tabs open for this video because there was a lot I wanted to discuss. I wanted to make sure I covered it as well as possible. And even then, I think those same reasonable minds would come in and say, Rick, you missed this aspect of this thing because it's a huge branching tree. And I would say, yep, you're absolutely right. And maybe it would have been more useful to have that discussion. But I did the best I could. And I thank you so much for the super chat, Britt. Joe, you talk about not engaging with the worst argument while doing it yourself. Thank you for the super chat. Do I don't know which side of that would be. I think probably the closest I come is when I talk about the article writers making these particular assumptions. And I would love to have pointed out the articles where people are taking a more centralized, less incendiary approach. I didn't really find those in my research. I might have missed them. I might have picked the most incendiary. And if I did that, I'm a human being too. So I apologize for that biases. Thank you for calling me out on it if that did happen. And thank you so much for the super chat, Joe. Fade to Gray, thank you for being a member. I heard a rumor that SBI are a front for a shadow cabal on the moon and that Gamergate version 2 are being puppeteered by hostile space aliens. That rumor might be out there. I think that it lacks evidence, Fade to Gray. I have to be honest. I do like the profile image here as an angry turtle. But I think it is unlikely that they're being puppeteered by hostile space aliens. If anything, the space aliens are probably friendly. They just seek to alter our environment and reality for their own. So thank you, Fade to Gray. I really appreciate you being a member. Britt, hold on. I cannot harass people in the chat or the host. Now I have to rethink my whole plan. LOL. Thank you, Britt, and thank you for abiding by the rules of the community here. Yes, we don't like ad hominem attacks. We don't like harassment. The one thing that all of the mods here know is that if you're going to attack somebody on the basis of their identity or personhood rather than the arguments that they make, that isn't the kind of thing that is welcome in this community. We want to continue to have reasonable minds can differ as our watchword here. So yes, Britt, I know you're making a joke, but thank you for again highlighting that. Parallax abstraction, if a consultant wants to just be yes men, then they're failing in their role. I agree. I'm a consultant in IT. My job is to frequently tell clients what they don't want to hear and push them on it. Yes, and that's a good consultant, Parallax. I appreciate that. I do think, however, that chances are when you're talking about something like narrative, which doesn't have the same kind of ones and zeros, yes and no, works or doesn't work as IT or technology in general, you do tend to have whatever your own desires are or biases, whatever that might be, it kind of reflected in the consultants and groups that you bring in to help you out. I do think that happens more in kind of the softer aspects of creation than in the harder ones. But absolutely, if they are just being yes men, they aren't being useful, right? And that's part of the things, part of the complaints you have about consultants. This used to be a fight that people would have in firm meetings at the firms that I worked at, where the partners would discuss whether a consultant, a strategic consultant, was valuable. And for the most part, they would predominantly just tell you what the CEO wanted to have happen with the entity, and then have a big old budget line item for the pleasure. And so I do think that that is something that, if they're just yes men, they're failing at their job, is accurate, but also the truth of the situation in many circumstances. My co-streamer is a brony. Oh my goodness, really? Thank you for the super chat. Love the coverage. I don't have a co-streamer, but if they were, they might be a brony. I don't know. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for supporting the channel. I really, really appreciate it. Bishop Cruz, it's uncanny how similar all these articles are. Same unfounded claims, same straw man. It's as if they cannot understand issues people are bringing up. Well, it's that they don't want to engage with those things, right? And so once you have the Kotaku article, once you have things to base your description on, you can write that article. And I say this as someone that likes journalists. I work with journalists a lot. I give a lot of quotes to various outlets because I want more and better information out there. But you can get into this spiral, especially if it's what you already believe, right? If you believe that folks that don't like what happened with Spider-Man 2 are other, right? Are less than human, are somebody that should be fought against already, then finding proof that they are doing that isn't really necessary. You already know that that's true, and you can write an article on that premise, especially when you have other articles being written on that same premise. So it's kind of part of the human experience to have that self-fulfilling echo chamber. And I don't really fault them for it, but I would prefer it if journalists were more aware that that exists. Lucius Augustus, thank you for the super chat again. Gamergate's biggest issue was people talking past each other. This is incredibly similar in that capacity, not to associate you with it at all. You can associate me with it. I just wasn't a part of those conversations at all in 2014. I wasn't online. Didn't have this channel. And I do think that what I saw the most here was defenses in those articles that were not responsive to the things that I was seeing claimed about Sweet Baby Inc. And so once you make it a straw man, once you fight that straw man and kill him, you have little left to do other than keep repeating that killing blow to that straw man. So that's what I wanted to highlight in those articles. And I wanted to have this discussion because I think it's important to have conversations like this, even if you're scared of them, even if you think the take this or other people are going to say that you're not doing a good enough job being loud and against these various things. Steampunk, did you see that Homeland Security funded Take This, demanding gaming companies to denounce the harassments? I did not, but it wouldn't surprise me. There are a lot of grant organizations out there that give money for various things on this topic. So it doesn't surprise me if that is in fact the case, but I did not see that myself. So I will take that as rumor for right now. Thank you, Steampunk. I appreciate it. Picklington, thank you so much for the £5 super chat. I don't think Kim Belair's comments in these articles match with her GDC presentation. Your mileage may vary. Hope you and yours are well. I have to watch that GDC presentation because I don't know for sure one way or the other. Thank you so much for highlighting that for me, and I appreciate the super chat. Judy, you got this. Thanks for this grounding. Helps for other areas of my life that seem to be popping off. I hope so. Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed with various things. And honestly, I'm a human being just like everybody else. I get overwhelmed by all sorts of things on the internet or in life. So I do try to be grounding, and I do try to look at things from all perspectives. That bothers some people on some things like this. I knew it would, but I wanted to have this conversation anyway. Thank you so much for being a member. Adam Unfriended, thank you so much for the generous super chat. Do you think there can be legal action against the Sweet Baby Inc. about violating the Civil Rights Act for extortion or both? They have a GDC speech that can be evidence for their extortion, and they have been open about being racist. The answer to that is almost certainly not. In general, the First Amendment, right to freedom of speech, is one of the strongest protective provisions we have in the United States. So in order to get up to extortion, violations of the Civil Rights Act is generally a government kind of situation. You have to get into some really odd areas of proof. Again, I don't know the GDC speech so much, but even if you are openly racist, chances are you aren't violating most of the Civil Rights Act or American law, because we do have that right of freedom of speech and press. So my answer is, without a greater understanding of what you're specifically pointing to, no. But that's because most of the answers to that for any given thing would be no. It's possible there might be something there, but I would doubt it. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for the super chats throughout the course of this video. I do want to mention that we do have a Patreon. We do have Player if you want to support this channel a little bit further. Those links should be in the description. And completely separate and not a link right now, I don't consider myself a hero, but I am nominated for being one. The American Stroke Association has Stroke Hero Awards that are up for nomination right now. And I am one of the nominees. You can see here I have 1,990 votes. You can vote once per day. I will link this in the description of the video after this is over if you're interested in that. My community is doing such a great job for me. I really do appreciate it. This is a cool thing that my wife nominated me for. But the Sistema de Salud Menonita, or Centro de Neurosciences Menonita Caguas, I'm terrible at pronunciation, so sorry about that, Puerto Rico, is right on my heels with 1,777 votes. Now, they're a whole facility that do multiple surgeries per year. So please do take a look at that if you're interested, and consider voting for me at heroes.stroke.org. I will add that link to the description. Thank you so much for your consideration on that. And then for anybody else that has questions or comments, I don't want to just limit it to super chats. Let me come in here and answer some questions. Raphael, thank you. Hoeg Law, question: the creator of the group is actually a Brazilian. Are they still liable about harassment under US law or actually under Brazilian law? So the liability comes from contract, right? So if you are going to be in trouble for harassing under the Steam rules, it comes from their contract that's under Washington law. And that's why we looked at Washington law as part of this video. Now, they might not have the jurisdiction to go grab them, but if you're Steam, you don't need to go grab them. You just turn off their access to their account. They don't need to leave Washington to do that. So when you talk about liability for harassment, the penalties are most likely loss of the account access. That can happen within Washington. You don't really need to go to Brazil or anywhere else. So anytime you're interacting with a US-based platform like YouTube or otherwise, chances are they can do the bad things to you without leaving the comfort of their homes. And so that might vary depending on what we're talking about. But in this particular case, we'd be looking at Washington law specifically. We'd be looking at the applicability of the contract language that you enter into when you become a Steam subscriber. Mark Jansen says, thanks for the efforts, Hoeg. Means a lot to me. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. Parallax Abstraction said the problem is that when it comes to the games press on issues like this, reasonable minds are rarely a factor. I don't want to say any of the articles are written without a reasonable mind. I just think that they often self-reinforce what they think is happening in the world as it stands and don't actually go through the process of looking for the evidence necessary to backstop that, because they already know the bad people are bad people. And I think every human being can fall into that trap. Somebody in the super chats accused me of falling into that trap just with the articles I selected. So I think everybody should take different perspectives and look at different content creators or article writers and try to get a handle on what's happening yourself. Unfortunately, with a story like this, there are so many articles written and so much noise that becomes very difficult to do. So I hope that I was helpful in that regard in this space. Shireen, yep, thanks, Hoeg. These streams are always enjoyable. Thank you, Shireen. I really appreciate it. Joe says, I don't think consulting in games in and of itself is an issue, but SBI does this in such a way that's aggressive and hateful. I can't speak to it being hateful. The quotes that I saw in those articles weren't. I know there are references in other articles to things that might have been said on X or on social media that rubbed people the wrong way. But I really didn't want to get into the individual personalities at play here as much as I wanted to talk about the companies and the discussion in the media as part of this entire thing, as well as that Gamergate article came out last night. And I wanted to highlight that because I do think that that's going a little bit far in the description of what's happening here. Video Vice 25 says consultation should be in-house. Well, it wouldn't be consulting then. It would just be having your employees answer questions. But I do think there's value to that, having a closer relationship. Excuse me. Elite Rubber Duck says, I think the sensitivity reading stuff in most cases, whether books, movies, scripts, or games, is a form of vandalism foisted on writers by publishers. Not in all cases, but many. I think you can see instances of it being a kind of vandalism. I think we saw a story about Roald Dahl works being changed after the fact, but I don't know that a publisher or even a writer just wanting a sensitivity reading on their own is some kind of vandalism. If I were writing a story about a culture that I knew nothing about, I would want somebody with some of that information to perhaps help out. I'd, of course, do my own research, but that research wouldn't be perfect. And a second set of eyes is often helpful in any creative endeavor. Ray XYZ says there's also a GDC talk with an SBI employee where she explicitly said to scare the marketing team to hire them. The optics of that are not great. We saw that reference in one of the articles. I think we see that reference in some of these quotes that we saw in the chats and whatnot. And I think that might be what they're referring to. That isn't great, right? But it's also understandable as kind of marketing puffery. You say, well, we're going to encourage you to do this, say essentially that if you try to write this character without our help, it's going to go poorly for you, and our help can improve your chances of having a successful product. If you're a consultant group, that's what you do. You are out there doing sales. They say they are a narrative consultancy and they're writing a lot of the time. That's true. That's the widgets they sell. But part of being a consultant group is having to go out there and sell your services to the next bidder. And so it might not look great. It might not be good optics. And I will look at that video at some point in the future, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's predominantly essentially puffery or marketing speak. I'm just trying to grab a little bit more here, and a very generous super chat. Gamergate's issue. Oh, no, we got that one. I wanted to grab the next one. Sorry. Britt, thank you for so many super chats today. I really appreciate the support for the channel. When I see a lot of similar language across so many platforms, I start to think, are they talking to each other in the background? Sure, it might be a conspiracy, but with the leaks about similar activists the past few years, I cannot help it anymore. I do think there's some coordination between journalists. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I talked about this a little bit in Last Stand Media. If you go and you look at the summon signs video that I was on with Bradley Ellis and Colin Moriarty, and one of the questions that came in was, do you believe in conspiracy theories? And I said, I don't really believe in the people in a shadowy room deciding on what the truth is for everyone, because in my experience, organizations can't really hold that level of sophistication or secrecy. But I do believe that, especially when information has only certain points of kind of release into the public sphere, that the fewer number of people that actually have access to the truth can impact how that truth is perceived by people. And that's not really a conspiracy theory as so much as acknowledging that some of the things that we know to be true about the world come from a very small amount of sources. And that can be something like Sweet Baby Inc. That can be something more important than this. Thank you so much for the generous super chat, Britt. John says, so how about that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, eh? Swoop, trying to change the subject on us. Thank you for the super chat, Don. I actually got in more trouble tweeting about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth yesterday than I did about Sweet Baby Inc. So I'm not sure I want to take on that comment as a change in a change in content, but Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a good game. I'm not sure it's a great game, and I think it's got a narrative momentum problem of its own, completely unrelated to anything that might touch on Sweet Baby Inc., although they might have consulted on this game. I don't know. But it is that kind of meandering plot line that lacks a little bit of forward momentum that has bothered me in a lot of AAA games of late, and that I think is handled a little bit better in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. But I will have that conversation more fulsomely on the Bitcast this Sunday, or we might not have that episode. We'll see what's happening there. Fade Gray says, I think it's fair to suspect that SBI might be involved in the writing of these articles, but it can easily be explained by the writers being blinded by their own biases. I have no doubt that when we see the quotes and things that come from Sweet Baby Inc., that there is a PR effort to massage what these articles wind up saying, but I don't think they're writing them for themselves. That doesn't usually work with journalists in any kind of decent respect. Any journalist worth their salt is not going to want the article written for them and then placed under their name. So I think they are trying to push things in a specific way. That's normal for PR, but I don't think they're writing the articles themselves. Semantic Dragon says the lead narrative designer of Suicide Squad killed the Justice League is an employee of Sweet Baby Inc. Yeah, we covered that in one of the articles that we read as part of this video, that he worked for Rocksteady for a while and then went to another project and then ultimately to Sweet Baby Inc. He gave some quotes as part of the articles that we looked at. But again, I don't see Suicide Squad killed the Justice League as fundamentally owned by an outside narrative party. There's a lot of Rocksteady in there that you can kind of trace back to the Arkham games pretty easily. So I think it's an odd thing to say that Sweet Baby Inc. controlled, but there are aspects of that game that I know people are bothered by that do seem to be of the Sweet Baby Inc. variety. Things like the descriptions within the codex, the library of enemies and whatnot that happen in that game. And I like that game. I like that game more than I like Spider-Man 2. But that's just one guy's opinion on these things. Rob Frawley said the website that checked if a streamer played Hogwarts Legacy was used primarily to harass those creators. At what point is an innocuous service/group responsible for its users/members' actions? To the extent that it facilitates them, right? So if you have a website that says, did you play Hogwarts Legacy? And it says if you played Hogwarts Legacy, and then people use that to harass, that isn't your responsibility for sharing the information. It's publicly known information in most cases, but it could be in certain jurisdictions with the way they might write their harassment rules or policies. I would be wary of trying to attach that kind of activity to the bad acts of other people, because at some point the buck has to stop at the person doing the bad act, right? If we want to say that facilitated that thing, then where does that line of logic stop, right? Does it stop at the site that makes the Hogwarts Legacy website available? Does it stop at Twitch that makes the streams available? I would argue that it needs to stop with the people that are doing the harassing, and not what mechanisms they might find to facilitate their harassment on a kind of more opaque scale. But reasonable minds can differ on that. That's what the law is about, is finding the line where we want cause and damages to be applied. And I don't think that having a site that just says these people played Hogwarts Legacy on stream is necessarily harassment in and of itself. Just like I don't think Sweet Baby Inc. detected is harassment in and of itself. All right. Thank you. I'm just scanning the chat right now because we have a lot of people talking, and I want to make sure if there are any more questions, highlight them with @Hoeg Law or Q. I really do appreciate it. I can spy those things. I think I'm up to date. I don't see anything, and I'm about ready to call this episode at 2 hours or so. So if you've got a question, please do let me know. If you want to do a super chat, if you want to tell me about how that stroke vote is so fun, you can do that as well. But either way, I'm probably going to close up this video in about 5 minutes. So this is the last call for comments. Thank you so much. Gabriel, hey, Hoeg, came in late because of a doctor's appointment. Sorry to miss the stream. No need to apologize for a doctor's appointment. Believe me, I am the greatest advocate for doctor's appointments and keeping yourself healthy that can be after the last couple of years that I've had. So please do check yourself out. Make sure you're healthy. And it is A-okay to miss parts of a stream on YouTube. Believe me. Papa Rick says, thank you for the stream. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And Rob says, thanks for the reasonable take. Thanks, Hoeg. Or that's a reasonable take. Thanks, Hoeg. No problem, Rob. That's what I'm here for. I try to give reasonable takes. I can't promise they're all reasonable. I'm a human being like anybody else, but I do try on this score. And so we'll go to just the head here. Thank you, Hoeg. Hope everyone has a good day. Love this channel and chat. Thank you, Shell, and thank you for those memberships that you handed out earlier. Joe Munger, great conversation, Rick. Sorry we disagree so much. Still love your content. That is okay. Reasonable minds can differ. If everybody in the world agreed on everything, it would be a very boring place to live. And as long as we remember that other people are human beings, disagreements do not have to end the conversation. So, Joe, you are welcome to be here and disagree with me as much as you want. Thank you so much. Tigerette says, have a wonderful week, y'all. It's been great. Thanks for the wonderful chat and stream. Thank you, Tigerette. Semantic Dragon says, all I can say is they're terrible writers from all evidence I've seen. I tend to believe that they are not good writers. They don't seem to be adding or additive, as they say in their quote, to me, to these video games. And so I might be willing to track what they are involved with because I don't think they are making good video game narratives. But that's a completely different critique, and it's not one that's addressed by any of these articles. Or as my Nightbot says, hey, we talk about politics sometimes. Doesn't mean that reasonable minds can't differ. So just remember that when we talk about these things. Chris says, why is IGN at the center of this? They tried to cancel Hogwarts Legacy some, avoided Mortal Kombat 1, and then went after Suicide Squad with a huge campaign. I know IGN has its issues. I don't know that they tried to cancel Hogwarts Legacy, although they did give it to my friend Travis to review. So that's its own kind of death knell. They definitely went after Suicide Squad with a weird level of reports. I don't know why that happened exactly, but I don't know that IGN is at the center of this. IGN does a lot of video game journalism, so they're probably at the center of everything to some extent, but I don't think they're the cause of all this. Mitchy Poo says, I enjoy diversity in games when it contributes to a game's overall immersion and narrative design. I just want good games and good writing, LOL. That's what I want. I have no problem with diversity and representation. I think those are great. But when they take away from the plotline, when they become their own thing, like I would argue they do in Spider-Man 2, that's where you get into trouble. Elias says, hey, are you doing any of the Sumail stuff? He is a Dota player who tried to sue his former team, and I'd like to know more about it, but I don't know how to start reading about it. I don't know that story. I might check it out if it's of interest, but I can't say without knowing more. So I'll take a look, Elias. Thank you for highlighting it for me. Michaela says, didn't Travis give HGL a 10? No, I think he gave it a 9. I want to say that the only 10 he gave last year was Asgard's Wrath 2, but I might be wrong. Eric Duff just says, or it is ham-fisted. The writing, perhaps. It's so nuanced, right? When I go through and look at writing or narrative of a video game, I analyze it in so many different ways that there are things that I'm sure that they do well, and there are things that I'm sure I would say they don't do well. And they can vary based on whatever game they're participating in. Again, I don't think Alan Wake 2 is overly affected by anything that you would consider politics. It's one of those where I said I loved Alan Wake 2. It was my game of the year last year, and people came into my comments and said, you mean Alan Woke? And I'm like, I don't know that you played it because there just really isn't that much politics in Alan Wake 2. And that is the kind of thing that does get close to, do you just hate that there's a black female lead in this game? And certainly when the game started, I was concerned that I wouldn't get to play as Alan Wake enough for someone that had waited since the original Alan Wake game. But you definitely get to play as Alan Wake enough in Alan Wake 2. So I just don't see that particular criticism of that game. Steampunk, thank you for the super chat. What I wish I could know is who worked on the Spanish translation for Spider-Man 2 and who decided to add Latin terms to it. I can't speak to that. I don't know. I know that Spider-Man 2, in addition to the things that I mentioned, also had the problem with adding the Cuban flag instead of the Puerto Rican flag as representative of Miles' background and ethnic history, which seems like the kind of thing that a Sweet Baby Inc. should flag and help with, no pun intended. But they're very specific in their quotes about not working on flags. So who's to say on that? The Real Mark Smith says Alan Wake is a really good game. Alan Wake is one of my top 5 games of all time. Alan Wake 2 is a little less than that, but still a tremendous game and my favorite game of last year. Shireen says, for the Stroke Awards, do I get to go to a ceremony? I don't believe there's a ceremony, but I don't know for sure. I haven't won one before. I don't know that I'll win this one. But I have not been told of any ceremony. I'm not even sure if there's a award, other than the fact that the picture of the person on the website has a like a glass award in their hand. So we'll see. Ray XYZ says, I honestly like Saga section way more, although I was never a big fan of Alan Wake per se. To get into the weeds on video games, I think Saga Anderson's sections are closer to Alan Wake's original sections in his first game. So I tended to like those sections more as well. I think she's a good character. It was really only that line towards the end where I said, what was that? Where did that come from? That seemed like a random kind of injection of modern day politics into a game that really doesn't have any. And so that was odd. That's an odd moment in the game. But I do think that Alan Wake 2 is a tremendous game. People should play it. It's something the folks should try, regardless of whether Sweet Baby Inc. worked on it or not. Tidge says, I think Alan Wake is a bad example, and a shield companies like SBI hide behind. It's possible. It's also possible that they didn't really do much on it. If you go and you look at their website, you see that they describe what it is that they did on these various things. And Alan Wake 2 is just listed as character arc, voice, and sensitivity reading. So it isn't the same as something like Spider-Man 2 that says story, or God of War Ragnarok that says narrative and character consultation with a focus on representation, right? Those are different than what is described for Alan Wake 2. So my suspicion, which is just speculation, is that Remedy wanted that sensitivity reading, and they had some things to say about language used and the character arc of Saga Anderson or others within that space. And that's what they did for Alan Wake 2. And Alan Wake 2 was otherwise predominantly not affected by any kind of story consultancy because Sam Lake, the creative director of Remedy, has such a strong, unique voice as it stands, right? If you take a consultant and you add them to a very strong voice, that voice is still probably going to win the day for the most part. Unlike a Marvel game, or I would argue Sony Santa Monica, who doesn't maybe have that strong of a voice on their own. And so you can have tweaks and changes that are a little bit more obvious than in something like Alan Wake. But regardless, it's clear to me that Sweet Baby Inc. did not ruin Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 is fantastic. So I don't agree with just saying every time they appear, I don't want to play their game. But it might be that if they appear with Sony companies of this type, that I'm less inclined to follow them after Spider-Man 2, which was my biggest disappointment of last year. I loved the first two Spider-Man games, and I really did not like Spider-Man 2. For what reason might that be? That's open to discussion, but that's the state of things as I see it. Tim Moore says, I like Saga's change because of who her father is. Agreed. 100%. I was trying to allude to that in the video, and we won't go into spoilers here, but I agree with that. That is the kind of thing that I think makes sense in the world of the video game and the story. H Weirdo, the only visual novel Sweet Baby worked on is Goodbye Volcano High, and it's been reviewed very poorly, so I doubt they're good writers. I can't speak to that. Honestly, I always caution people, creatives and creativity in general have to go through so many loops of funding and studio management that it's always unclear exactly who's responsible for either a success or a failure. So until you have a kind of streak of successes or failures, it's really hard to pin down what's happening behind the scenes. And I always caution people to do that from afar because it's always speculation. But I do think that of the things that I have seen them be involved with that feel a little weird, they tend to be on the credit screen. So I think that I think that is worth noting, even if I wouldn't be as vociferous in my boycotting of their functioning in the space as some people in these groups or that are discussed in these articles. Ray XYZ says, I think that line works in the context it was said without spoiling anything. It was at a time when Saga was riddled with doubts and fear. And I want to give them full credit, right? If they wrote that section, and again, this is all like a spoiler, not spoiler, Alan Wake 2 discussion. If they wrote that section, that I thought was one of the most effective sections in the game. So if they worked on that, bully for them. If they didn't, bully for Remedy. Either way, it got into the game. I'm really happy that it was there. I think you can argue that that does happen in that context and that you can argue that that's fair for that reason. It just really does come out of nowhere for the character you've played for the whole game. But I think that's fair, Ray XYZ. I really do. On the other hand, Marlon Carrero says that one line from Saga Anderson near the end of the game was so out of place, took me out of the game for a minute. Great character otherwise, but that felt like SBI work in a small way. I didn't know where it came from. It just felt really weird. And as you can see from Ray XYZ, reasonable minds can differ on this point as well. So if it worked for you in the context of the game, great. I am not the final arbiter of what works in a game or game narrative. So absolutely. Semantic Dragon says, I also didn't like starting with Saga when it's Alan Wake. It creates confusion in the customer. There's no reason they couldn't start as Alan and then transition to Saga. Well, they do, right? The very first cutscene is Alan Wake narrating and talking about himself, and then they don't actually start with Saga, as you know if you played that game. Don, thank you for the super chat. Agree with Spider-Man 2 being disappointing. It has worse gameplay, a worse story, and overall less interesting. Still good, but not as good as 1. Pretty game. It's a very pretty game. And I wanted to love Spider-Man 2. I was really excited about it. I thought it would be a game of the year kind of contender. And it was my most disappointing game of last year, which was one of my favorite years in gaming. So why is that? Is that because of Sweet Baby Inc.? Is that because of something different at Insomniac? It has the same leads as Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales. So it's a little surprising that happened. And so you start looking for reasons. That's when you get into conspiracy theories, because we don't actually know what happened behind the scenes. But Spider-Man 2, for whatever reason, didn't work for me. Tage says, I'm not put off Alan Wake 2 because of their involvement. It's just not my kind of game. If I was a fan of the original, I'd probably play it either way. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be your kind of game. It's survival horror. It is weird and supernatural. If you don't like that, it's not going to change whether Sweet Baby Inc. helped write for it or not. So absolutely, we all have to be the curators of our own gaming and other media libraries. And if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. All right, everybody. Well, so that's about it. I'm about out of speed and about out of lung and throat capacity, if you can't tell. Thank you so much for being here. Again, I hope this was an informative discussion on a very controversial topic online right now. Thank you so much for helping support the channel. Please do consider liking, subscribing, leaving comments. I love having these conversations in this space because so many people take care to really think about the issues at hand and have good conversations with all of us. And that's part of what I love about all of you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for helping support the channel through membership, super chats, like, subscribes, players, Patreon, and everything else. And of course, for helping vote for the Stroke Heroes Voters' Choice Award. I'm very enthused about being nominated, even though it takes a lot for me to say I might be a stroke hero. That doesn't feel like me, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody. And I will see you on the next episode on this channel, whether that's a Virtual Legality or Hangouts and Headlines. Thank you, everyone.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.